The History of Whittington of the Blue Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Blue Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. The History of Whittington. Dick Whittington was a very little boy when his father and mother died, so little indeed that he never knew them, nor the place where he was born. He strolled about the country as ragged as a colt, till he met with a wagoner who was going to London, and who gave him leave to walk all the way by the side of his wagon without paying anything for his passage. This pleased little Whittington very much, as he wanted to see London sadly, for he had heard that the streets were paved with gold, and he was willing to get a bushel of it. But how great was his disappointment, poor boy, when he saw the streets covered with dirt instead of gold, and found himself in a strange place without a friend, without food, and without money. Though the wagoner was so charitable as to let him walk up by the side of the wagon for nothing, he took care not to know him when he came to town, and the poor boy was, in a little time, so cold and hungry that he wished himself in a good kitchen and by a warm fire in the country. In his distress he asked charity of several people, and one of them bid him go work for an idle rogue. "That I will," said Whittington, "with all my heart. I will work for you if you will let me." The man, who thought this savored of wit and impertinence, though the poor lad intended only to show his readiness to work, gave him a blow with a stick which broke his head so that the blood ran down. In this situation, and fainting for want of food, he laid himself down at the door of one Mr. Fitzwarren, a merchant, where the cook saw him, and, being an ill-natured hussy, ordered him to go about his business, or she would scald him. At this time Mr. Fitzwarren came from the Exchange, and began also to scold at the poor boy, bidding him to go to work. Whittington answered that he should be glad to work if anybody would employ him, and that he should be able if he could get some victuals to eat, for he had had nothing for 3 days, and he was a poor country boy and knew nobody, and nobody would employ him. He then endeavored to get up, but he was so very weak that he fell down again, which excited so much compassion in the merchant that he ordered the servants to take him in and give him some meat and drink, and let him help the cook to do any dirty work that she had to set him about. People are too apt to reproach those who beg with being idle, but give themselves no concern to put them in the way of getting business to do, or considering whether they are able to do it, which is not charity. But we return to Whittington, who could have lived happily in this worthy family had he not been bumped about by the cross cook, who must be always roasting and basting, or when the spit was idle employed her hands upon poor Whittington. At last Miss Alice, his master's daughter, was informed of it, and then she took compassion on the poor boy and made the servants treat him kindly. Besides the crossness of the cook, Whittington had another difficulty to get over before he could be happy. He had, by order of his master, a flock bed placed for him in a garret, where there was a number of rats and mice that often ran over the poor boy's nose and disturbed him in his sleep. After some time, however, a gentleman who came to his master's house gave Whittington a penny for brushing his shoes. This he put into his pocket, being determined to lay it out to the best advantage, and the next day, seeing a woman in the street with a cat under her arm, he ran up to know the price of it. The woman, as the cat was a good mouser, asked a deal of money for it, but on Whittington's telling her he had but a penny in the world, and that he wanted a cat sadly, she let him have it. This cat Whittington concealed in the garret, for fear she should be beat about by his mortal enemy the cook, and here she soon killed or frightened away the rats and mice, so that the poor boy could now sleep as sound as a top. Soon after this, the merchant, who had a ship ready to sail, called for his servants, as his custom was, in order that each of them might venture something to try their luck, and whatever they sent was to pay neither freight nor custom, for he thought justly that God Almighty would bless him the more for his readiness to let the poor partake of his fortune. All the servants appeared but poor Whittington, who, having neither money nor goods, could not think of sending anything to try his luck, but his good friend Miss Alice, thinking his poverty kept him away, ordered him to be called. She then offered to lay down something for him, but the merchant told his daughter that would not do, it must be something of his own. Upon which poor Whittington said he had nothing but a cat which he bought for a penny that was given him. "Fetch thy cat, boy," said the merchant, "and send her." Whittington brought poor Puss and delivered her to the captain, with tears in his eyes, for he said he should now be disturbed by the rats and mice as much as ever. All the company laughed at the adventure but Miss Alice, who pitied the poor boy and gave him something to buy another cat. While Puss was beating the billows at sea, poor Whittington was severely beaten at home by his tyrannical mistress the cook, who used him so cruelly, and made such game of him for sending his cat to sea, that at last the poor boy determined to run away from his place, and having packed up the few things he had, he set out very early in the morning on All Hallows Day. He travelled as far as Holloway, and there sat down on a stone to consider what course he should take. But while he was thus ruminating, bow bells, of which there were only 6, began to ring. He thought their sounds addressed him in this manner: "Turn again, Whittington, thrice Lord Mayor of London." "Lord Mayor of London!" said he to himself. "What would not one endure to be Lord Mayor of London, and ride in such a fine coach? Well, I'll go back again, and bear all the pummelling and ill usage of Cicely, rather than miss the opportunity of being Lord Mayor." So home he went, and happily got into the house and about his business before Mrs. Cicely made her appearance. We must now follow Miss Puss to the coast of Africa. How perilous are voyages at sea, how uncertain the winds and the waves, and how many accidents attend a naval life! The ship that had the cat on board was long beaten at sea, and at last by contrary winds driven on a part of the coast of Barbary, which was inhabited by Moors and unknown to the English. These people received our countrymen with civility, and therefore the captain, in order to trade with them, showed them the patterns of the goods he had on board, and sent some of them to the king of the country, who was so well pleased that he sent for the captain and the factor to come to his palace, which was about a mile from the sea. Here they were placed, according to the custom of the country, on rich carpets, flowered with gold and silver, and the king and queen being seated at the upper end of the room, dinner was brought in, which consisted of many dishes, but no sooner were the dishes put down but an amazing number of rats and mice came from all quarters and devoured all the meat in an instant. The factor, in surprise, turned round to the nobles and asked if these vermin were not offensive. "Oh, yes," said they, "very offensive, and the king would give half his treasure to be freed of them, for they not only destroy his dinner, as you see, but they assault him in his chamber, and even in bed, so that he is obliged to be watched while he is sleeping, for fear of them." The factor jumped for joy. He remembered poor Whittington and his cat, and told the king he had a creature on board the ship that would dispatch all these vermin immediately. The king's heart heaved so high at the joy which this news gave him that his turban dropped off his head. "Bring this creature to me," he said. "Vermin are dreadful in a court, and if she will perform what you say, I will load your ship with gold and jewels in exchange for her." The factor, who knew his business, took this opportunity to set forth the merits of Miss Puss. He told his Majesty that it would be inconvenient to part with her, as, when she was gone, the rats and mice might destroy the goods in the ship, but to oblige his Majesty he would fetch her. "Run, run!" said the Queen. "I am impatient to see the dear creature." Away flew the factor, while another dinner was providing, and returned with the cat just as the rats and mice were devouring that also. He immediately put down Miss Puss, who killed a great number of them. The king rejoiced greatly to see his old enemies destroyed by so small a creature, and the Queen was highly pleased, and desired the cat might be brought near that she might look at her. Upon which the factor called, "Pussy, pussy, pussy!" and she came to him. He then presented her to the Queen, who started back, and was afraid to touch a creature who had made such havoc among the rats and mice. However, when the factor stroked the cat and called, "Pussy, pussy!" the Queen also touched her and cried, "Putty, putty!" for she had not learned English. He then put her down on the Queen's lap, where she, purring, played with her Majesty's hand, and then sang herself to sleep. The King, having seen the exploits of Miss Puss, and being informed that her kittens would stock the whole country, bargained with the captain and factor for the whole ship's cargo, and then gave them 10 times as much for the cat as all the rest amounted to, on which, taking leave of their Majesties and other great personages at court, they sailed with a fair wind for England, whither we must now attend them. The morn had scarce dawned when Mr. Fitzwarren arose to count over the cash and settle the business for that day. He had just entered the counting-house and seated himself at the desk, when somebody came, tap, tap, at the door.
"Who's there?"
said Mr. Fitzwarren.
"A friend,"
answered the other.
"What friend can come at this unseasonable time?" "A real friend is never unseasonable," answered the other. "I come to bring you good news of your ship Unicorn." The merchant bustled up in such a hurry that he forgot his gout, instantly opened the door, and who should be seen waiting but the captain and factor with a cabinet of jewels and a bill of lading, for which the merchant lifted up his eyes and thanked heaven for sending him such a prosperous voyage. Then they told him the adventures of the cat, and showed him the cabinet of jewels which they had brought for Mr. Whittington, upon which he cried out with great earnestness, but not in the most poetical manner, "Go, send him in, and tell him of his fame, and call him Mr. Whittington by name." It is not our business to animadvert upon these lines. We are not critics, but historians. It is sufficient for us that they are the words of Mr. Fitzwarren, and though it is beside our purpose, and perhaps not in our power to prove him a good poet, we shall soon convince the reader that he was a good man, which was a much better character. For when some who were present told him that this treasure was too much for such a poor boy as Whittington, he said, "God forbid that I should deprive him of a penny. It is his own, and he shall have it to a farthing." He then ordered Mr. Whittington in, who was at this time cleaning the kitchen, and would have excused himself from going into the counting-house, saying the room was swept and his shoes were dirty and full of hobnails. The merchant, however, made him come in, and ordered a chair to be set for him, upon which, thinking they intended to make sport for him, as had been too often the case in the kitchen, he besought his master not to mock a poor simple fellow who intended them no harm, but let him go about his business. The merchant, taking him by the hand, said, "Indeed, Mr. Whittington, I am in earnest with you, and sent for you to congratulate you on your great success. Your cat has procured you more money than I am worth in the world, and may you long enjoy it and be happy." At length, being shown the treasure, and convinced by them that all of it belonged to him, he fell upon his knees and thanked the Almighty for his providential care of such a poor and miserable creature. He then laid all the treasure at his master's feet, who refused to take any part of it, but told him he heartily rejoiced at his prosperity, and hoped the wealth he had acquired would be a comfort to him and would make him happy. He then applied to his mistress and to his good friend Miss Alice, who refused to take any part of the money, but told him she heartily rejoiced at his good success, and wished him all imaginable felicity. He then gratified the captain, factor, and the ship's crew for the care they had taken of his cargo. He likewise distributed presents to all the servants in the house, not forgetting even his old enemy the cook, though she little deserved it. After this, Mr. Fitzwarren advised Mr. Whittington to send for the necessary people, and dress himself like a gentleman, and made him the offer of his house to live in till he could provide himself with a better.
Now it came to pass when Mr. Whittington's face was washed, his hair curled, and he dressed in a rich suit of clothes, that he turned out a genteel young fellow, and as wealth contributes much to give a man confidence, he in a little time dropped that sheepish behavior which was principally occasioned by a depression of spirits, and soon grew a sprightly and good companion, insomuch that Miss Alice, who had formerly pitied him, now fell in love with him. When her father perceived they had this good liking for each other, he proposed a match between them, to which both parties cheerfully consented, and the Lord Mayor, Court of Aldermen, Sheriffs, the Company of Stationers, the Royal Academy of Arts, and a number of eminent merchants attended the ceremony, and were elegantly treated at an entertainment made for that purpose. History further relates that they lived very happy, had several children, and died at a good age. Mr. Whittington served as Sheriff of London, and was 3 times Lord Mayor. In the last year of his mayoralty, he entertained King Henry V and his Queen after his conquest of France, upon which occasion the King, in consideration of Whittington's merit, said, "Never had Prince such a subject," which, being told to Whittington at the table, he replied, "Never had subject such as a king." His Majesty, out of respect to his good character, conferred the honor of knighthood on him soon after. Sir Richard, many years before his death, constantly fed a great number of poor citizens, built a church and a college to it, with a yearly allowance for poor scholars, and near it erected a hospital. He also built Newgate for criminals, and gave liberally to St. Bartholomew's Hospital and other public charities. End of the History of Whittington. Recording by Scott Robbins.
The Wonderful Sheep of the Blue Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. That's LibriVox.org. Recording by Christy Nowak. The Blue Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. The Wonderful Sheep. Once upon a time, in the days when fairies lived, there was a king who had 3 daughters, who were all young and clever and beautiful. But the youngest of the 3, who was called Miranda, was the prettiest and most beloved. The king, her father, gave her more dresses and jewels in a month than he gave the others in a year. But she was so generous that she shared everything with her sisters, and they were all as happy and as fond of one another as they could be. Now the king had some quarrelsome neighbors, who, tired of leaving him in peace, began to make war upon him so fiercely that he feared he would be altogether beaten if he did not make an effort to defend himself. So he collected a great army and set off to fight them, leaving the princesses with their governess in a castle where news of the war was brought every day, sometimes that the king had taken a town or won a battle, and, at last, that he had altogether overcome his enemies and chased them out of his kingdom, and was coming back to the castle as quickly as possible to see his dear little Miranda, whom he loved so much. The 3 princesses put on dresses of satin which they had made on purpose for this great occasion, 1 green, 1 blue, and the 3rd white. Their jewels were the same colors. The eldest wore emeralds, the second turquoises, and the youngest diamonds, and thus adorned they went to meet the king, singing verses which they had composed about his victories. When he saw them all so beautiful and so gay, he embraced them tenderly, but gave Miranda more kisses than either of the others. Presently a splendid banquet was served, and the king and his daughters sat down to it, and as he always thought there was some special meaning in everything, he said to the eldest, "Tell me why you have chosen a green dress." "Sire," she answered, "having heard of your victories, I thought that green would signify my joy and the hope of your speedy return." "That is a very good answer," said the king. "And you, my daughter," he continued, "why did you take a blue dress?" "Sire," said the princess, "to show that we constantly hoped for your success, and that the sight of you is as welcome to me as the sky with its most beautiful stars." "Why," said the king, "your wise answers astonish me. And you, Miranda, what made you dress yourself all in white?" "Because, sire," she answered, "white suits me better than anything else." "What?" said the king angrily. "Was that all you thought of, vain child?" I thought you would be pleased with me," said the princess. "That was all." The king, who loved her, was satisfied with this, and even pretended to be pleased that she had not told him all her reasons at first. "And now," he said, "as I have supped well, and it is not time yet to go to bed, tell me what you dreamed last night." The eldest said she had dreamed that he brought her a dress, and the precious stones and gold embroidery on it were brighter than the sun. The dream of the second was that the king had brought her a spinning wheel and a distaff, that she might spin him some shirts. But the youngest said, "I dreamed that my second sister was to be married, and on her wedding day you, father, held a golden ewer and said, 'Come, Miranda, and I will hold the water, that you may dip your hands in it.'" The king was very angry indeed when he heard this dream, and frowned horribly. Indeed, he made such an ugly face that everyone knew how angry he was, and he got up and went off to bed in a great hurry, but he could not forget his daughter's dream. "Does the proud girl wish to make me her slave?" he said to himself. "I am not surprised at her choosing to dress herself in white satin without a thought of me. She does not think me worthy of her consideration. But I will soon put an end to her pretensions." He rose in a fury, and although it was not yet daylight, he sent for the captain of his bodyguard and said to him, "You have heard the Princess Miranda's dream. I consider that it means strange things against me. Therefore I order you to take her away into the forest and kill her, and, that I may be sure it is done, you must bring me her heart and her tongue. If you attempt to deceive me, you shall be put to death." The captain of the guard was very much astonished when he heard this barbarous order, but he did not dare to contradict the king, for fear of making him still more angry, or causing him to send someone else, so he answered that he would fetch the princess and do as the king had said. When he went to her room, they would hardly let him in, it was so early, but he said that the king had sent for Miranda, and she got up quickly and came out. A little black girl called Patty Pata held up her train, and her pet monkey and her little dog ran after her. The monkey was called Grabugeon, and the little dog Tintin. The captain of the guard begged Miranda to come down into the garden where the king was enjoying the fresh air, and when they got there, he pretended to search for him. But as he was not to be found, he said, "No doubt his majesty has strolled into the forest." And he opened the little door that led to it, and they went through. By this time the daylight had begun to appear, and the princess, looking at her conductor, saw that he had tears in his eyes and seemed too sad to speak. "What is the matter?" she said in the kindest way. "You seem very sorrowful." "Alas, princess," he answered, "who would not be sorrowful who was ordered to do such a terrible thing as I am? The king has commanded me to kill you here and carry your heart and tongue to him, and if I disobey, I shall lose my life." The poor princess was terrified. She grew very pale and began to cry softly. Looking up at the captain of the guard with her beautiful eyes, she said gently, "Will you really have the heart to kill me? I have never done you any harm, and have always spoken well of you to the king. If I had deserved my father's anger, I would suffer without a murmur, but alas, he is unjust to complain of me, when I have always treated him with love and respect." "Fear nothing, princess," said the captain of the guard. "I would far rather die myself than hurt you. But even if I am killed, you will not be safe. We must find some way of making the king believe that you are dead." "What can we do?" said Miranda. "Unless you take him my heart and my tongue, he will never believe you." The princess and the captain of the guard were talking so earnestly that they did not think of Patty Pata, but she had overheard all they said, and now came and threw herself at Miranda's feet. "Madame," she said, "I offer you my life. Let me be killed. I shall only be too happy to die for such a kind mistress." "Why, Patty Pata," cried the princess, kissing her, "that would never do. Your life is as precious to me as my own, especially after such a proof of your affection as you have just given me." "You are right, princess," said Grabugeon, coming forward, "to love such a faithful slave as Patty Pata. She is of more use to you than I am. I offer you my tongue and my heart most willingly, especially as I wish to make a great name for myself in Goblin Land." "Oh no, my little Grabugeon," replied Miranda, "I cannot bear the thought of taking your life." "Such a good little dog as I am," cried Tintin, "could not think of letting either of you die for his mistress. If anyone is to die for her, it must be me." And then began a great dispute between Patty Pata, Grabugeon, and Tintin, and they came to high words, until at last Grabugeon, who was quicker than the others, ran up to the very top of the nearest tree and let herself fall head first to the ground, and there she lay, quite dead. The princess was very sorry, But as Grabugeon was really dead, she allowed the captain of the guard to take her tongue, but alas, it was such a little one, not bigger than the princess's thumb, that they decided sorrowfully that it was of no use at all. The king would not have been taken in by it for a moment. "Alas, my little monkey!" cried the princess. "I have lost you, and yet I am no better off than I was before." "The honor of saving your life is to be mine," interrupted Patypata, and before they could prevent her, she had picked up a knife and cut her head off in an instant. But when the captain of the guard would have taken her tongue, it turned out to be quite black, so that would not have deceived the king either. "Am I not unlucky?" cried the poor princess. "I lose everything I love, and am none the better for it." "If you had accepted my offer," said Tintin, "you would only have had me to regret, and I should have had all your gratitude." Miranda kissed her little dog, crying so bitterly that at last she could bear it no longer and turned away into the forest. When she looked back, the captain of the guard was gone, and she was alone, except for Patypata, Grabugeon, and Tintin, who lay upon the ground. She could not leave the place until she had buried them in a pretty little mossy grave at the foot of a tree, and she wrote their names upon the bark of the tree, and how they had all died to save her life. And then she began to think where she could go for safety, for this forest was so close to her father's castle that she might be seen and recognized by the first passer-by, and, besides that, it was full of lions and wolves, who would have snapped up a princess just as soon as a stray chicken. So she began to walk as fast as she could, but the forest was so large and the sun was so hot that she nearly died of heat and terror and fatigue. Look which way she would, there seemed to be no end to the forest, and she was so frightened that she fancied every minute that she heard the king running after her to kill her. You may imagine how miserable she was, and how she cried as she went on, not knowing which path to follow, and with the thorny bushes scratching her dreadfully and tearing her pretty frock to pieces. At last she heard the bleating of a sheep, and said to herself, "No doubt there are shepherds here with their flocks. They will show me the way to some village where I can live disguised as a peasant girl. Alas, it is not always kings and princes who are the happiest people in the world. Who could have believed that I should ever be obliged to run away and hide because the king, for no reason at all, wishes to kill me?" So saying, she advanced toward the place where she heard the bleating. But what was her surprise when, in a lovely little glade, quite surrounded by trees, she saw a large sheep. Its wool was as white as snow, and its horns shone like gold. It had a garland of flowers round its neck, and strings of great pearls around its legs, and a collar of diamonds. It lay upon a bank of orange flowers under a canopy of cloth of gold which protected it from the heat of the sun. Nearly 100 other sheep were scattered about, not eating the grass, but some drinking coffee, lemonade, or sherbet, others eating ices, strawberries and cream, or sweetmeats, while others again were playing games. Many of them wore golden collars with jewels, flowers, and ribbons. Miranda stopped short in amazement at this unexpected sight, and was looking in all directions for the shepherd of this surprising flock, when the beautiful sheep came bounding toward her. "Approach, lovely princess," he cried. "Have no fear of such gentle and peaceable animals as we are." "What a marvel!" cried the princess, starting back a little. "Here is a sheep that can talk." "Your monkey and your dog could talk, madame," said he. "Are you more astonished at us than at them?" "A fairy gave them the power to speak," replied Miranda, "so I was used to them." "Perhaps the same thing has happened to us," he said, smiling sheepishly. "But, princess, what can have led you here?" "1,000 misfortunes, Sir Sheep," she answered. "I am the unhappiest princess in the world, and I am seeking a shelter against my father's anger." "Come with me, madame," said the sheep. "I offer you a hiding place which you only will know of, and where you will be mistress of everything you see." "I really cannot follow you," said Miranda, "for I am too tired to walk another step." The sheep with the golden horns ordered that his chariot should be fetched, and a moment after appeared 6 goats harnessed to a pumpkin which was so big that 2 people could quite well sit in it, and was all lined with cushions of velvet and down. The princess stepped into it, much amused at such a new kind of carriage, and the king of the sheep took his place beside her, and the goats ran away with them at full speed, and only stopped when they reached a cavern, the entrance to which was blocked by a great stone. This the king touched with his foot, and immediately it fell down, and he invited the princess to enter without fear. Now, if she had not been so alarmed by everything that had happened, nothing could have induced her to go into this frightful cave. But she was so afraid of what might be behind her that she would have thrown herself even down a well at this moment. So, without hesitation, she followed the sheep, who went before her, down, 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 until she thought they must come out at the other side of the world indeed. She was not sure that he wasn't leading her into fairyland. At last she saw before her a great plain, quite covered with all sorts of flowers, the scent of which seemed to her nicer than anything she had ever smelled before. A broad river of orange-flower water flowed round it, and fountains of wine of every kind ran in all directions and made the prettiest little cascades and brooks. The plain was covered with the strangest trees. There were whole avenues where partridges, ready roasted, hung from every branch. Or, if you preferred pheasants, quails, turkeys, or rabbits, you had only to turn to the right hand or to the left, and you were sure to find them. In places the air was darkened by showers of lobster patties, white puddings, sausages, tarts, and all sorts of sweetmeats, or with pieces of gold and silver, diamonds and pearls. This unusual kind of rain, and the pleasantness of the whole place would, no doubt, have attracted numbers of people to it, if the king of the sheep had been of a more sociable disposition. But from all accounts it is evident that he was as grave as a judge. As it was quite the nicest time of the year when Miranda arrived in this delightful land, the only palace she saw was a long row of orange trees, jasmines, honeysuckles, and musk roses, and their interlacing branches made the prettiest rooms possible, which were hung with gold and silver gauze, and had great mirrors and candlesticks, and most beautiful pictures. The wonderful sheep begged that the princess would consider herself queen over all that she saw, and assured her that, though for some years he had been very sad and in great trouble, she had it in her power to make him forgetful of all his grief. "You are so kind and generous, noble sheep," said the princess, "that I cannot thank you enough, but I must confess that all I see here seems to me so extraordinary that I don't know what to think of it." As she spoke, a band of lovely fairies came up, and offered her amber baskets full of fruit, but when she held out her hands to them they glided away, and she could feel nothing when she tried to touch them. "Oh," she cried, "what can they be? Whom am I with?" And she began to cry. At this instant the king of the sheep came back to her, and was so distracted to find her in tears that he could have torn his wool. "What is the matter, lovely princess?" he cried. "Has anyone failed to treat you with due respect?" "Oh, no," said Miranda. "Only I am not used to living with sprites and with sheep that talk, and everything here frightens me. It was very kind of you to bring me to this place, but I shall be even more grateful to you if you will take me up into the world again." "Do not be afraid," said the wonderful sheep. "I entreat you to have patience and listen to the story of my misfortunes. I was once a king, and my kingdom was the most splendid in the world. My subjects loved me, my neighbors envied and feared me. I was respected by everyone, and it was said that no king ever deserved it more. I was very fond of hunting, and one day, while chasing a stag, I left my attendants far behind. Suddenly I saw the animal leap into a pool of water, and I rashly urged my horse to follow it. But before we had gone many steps, I felt an extraordinary heat instead of the coolness of the water. The pond dried up, a great gulf opened before me, out of which flames of fire shot up, and I fell helplessly to the bottom of a precipice. I gave myself up for lost, but presently a voice said, "Ungrateful prince, even this fire is hardly enough to warm your cold heart." "Who complains of my coldness in this dismal place?" I cried. "An unhappy being who loves you hopelessly," replied the voice, and at the same moment the flames began to flicker and cease to burn, and I saw a fairy whom I had known as long as I could remember, and whose ugliness had always horrified me. She was leaning upon the arm of a most beautiful young girl who wore chains of gold on her wrists and was evidently her slave. "Why, Ragotte," I said, for that was the fairy's name, "what is the meaning of all this? Is it by your orders that I am here?" "And whose fault is it," she answered, "that you have never understood me until now? Must a powerful fairy like myself condescend to explain her doings to you, who are no better than an ant by comparison, though you think yourself a great king?" "Call me what you like," I said impatiently, "but what is it that you want? My crown, or my cities, or my treasures?" "Treasures," said the fairy disdainfully. "If I choose, I could make any one of my scullions richer and more powerful than you. I do not want your treasures, but," she added softly, "if you will give me your heart, if you will marry me, I will add 20 kingdoms to the one you have already. You shall have 100 castles full of gold and 500 full of silver, and, in short, anything you like to ask me for." "Madame Ragotte," I said, "when one is at the bottom of a pit, where one has fully expected to be roasted alive, it is impossible to think of asking such a charming person as you are to marry one. I beg that you will set me at liberty, and then I shall hope to answer you fittingly." "Ah," she said, If you really loved me, you would not care where you were. A cave, a wood, a foxhole, a desert would please you equally well. Do not think that you can deceive me. You fancy you are going to escape, but I assure you that you are going to stay here, and the first thing I shall give you to do will be to keep my sheep. They are very good company, and speak quite as well as you do." As she spoke, she advanced, and led me to this plain where we now stand, and showed me her flock, but I paid little attention to it or to her. To tell the truth, I was so lost in admiration of her beautiful slave that I forgot everything else, and the cruel Ragotte, perceiving this, turned upon her so furious and terrible a look that she fell lifeless to the ground. At this dreadful sight I drew my sword and rushed at Ragotte, and should certainly have cut off her head, had she not by her magic arts chained me to the spot on which I stood. All my efforts to move were useless, and at last, when I threw myself down on the ground in despair, she said to me with a scornful smile, "I intend to make you feel my power. It seems that you are a lion at present. I mean you to be a sheep." So saying, she touched me with her wand, and I became what you see. I did not lose the power of speech, or of feeling the misery of my present state. "For 5 years," she said, "you shall be a sheep, and lord of this pleasant land, while I, no longer able to see your face, which I loved so much, shall be better able to hate you, as you deserve to be hated." She disappeared as she finished speaking, and if I had not been too unhappy to care about anything, I should have been glad that she was gone. The talking sheep received me as their king, and told me that they too were unfortunate princes who had, in different ways, offended the revengeful fairy, and had been added to her flock for a certain number of years, some more, some less. From time to time, indeed, one regains his own proper form and goes back again to his place in the upper world. But the other beings whom you saw are the rivals or the enemies of Ragotte, whom she has imprisoned for 100 years or so, even though they will go back at last. The young slave of whom I told you about is one of these. I have seen her often, and it has been a great pleasure to me. She never speaks to me, and if I were nearer to her, I know I should find her only a shadow, which would be very annoying. However, I noticed that one of my companions in misfortune was also very attentive to this little sprite, and I found out that he had been her lover, whom the cruel Ragotte had taken away from her long before. Since then I have cared for and thought of nothing but how I might regain my freedom. I have often been in the forest. That is where I have seen you, lovely princess, sometimes driving your chariot, which you did with all the grace and skill in the world, sometimes riding to the chase on so spirited a horse that it seemed as if no one but yourself could have managed it, and sometimes running races on the plain with the princesses of your court, running so lightly that it was you always who won the prize. Oh, princess, I have loved you so long, and yet how dare I tell you of my love? What hope can there be for an unhappy sheep like myself?" Miranda was so surprised and confused by all that she had heard that she hardly knew what answer to give to the king of the sheep, but she managed to make some kind of little speech, which certainly did not forbid him to hope, and said that she should not be afraid of the shadows now she knew that they would some day come to life again. "Alas," she continued, "if my poor Patypata, my dear Grabugeon, and pretty little Tintin, who all died for my sake, were equally well off, I should have nothing left to wish for here." Prisoner though he was, the king of the sheep had still some powers and privileges. "Go," said he to his master of the horse, "go and seek the shadows of the little black girl, the monkey, and the dog. They will amuse our princess." And an instant afterward Miranda saw them coming toward her, and their presence gave her the greatest pleasure, though they did not come near enough for her to touch them. The king of the sheep was so kind and amusing, and loved Miranda so dearly, that at last she began to love him too. Such a handsome sheep, who was so polite and considerate, could hardly fail to please, especially if one knew that he was really a king, and that his strange imprisonment would soon come to an end. So the princess's days passed very gaily, while she waited for the happy time to come. The king of the sheep, with the help of all the flock, got up balls, concerts, and hunting parties, and even the shadows joined in all the fun, and came, making believe to be their own real selves. One evening, when the couriers arrived, for the king sent most carefully for news, and they always brought the very best kinds, it was announced that the sister of the Princess Miranda was going to be married to a great prince, and nothing could be more splendid than all the preparations for the wedding. "Ah," cried the young princess, "how unlucky I am to miss the sight of so many pretty things! Here am I, imprisoned under the earth, with no company but sheep and shadows, while my sister is to be adorned like a queen, and surrounded by all who love and admire her, and everyone but myself can go to wish her joy." "Why do you complain, princess?" said the king of the sheep. "Did I say that you were not to go to the wedding? Set out as soon as you please. Only promise me that you will come back, for I love you too much to be able to live without you." Miranda was very grateful to him, and promised faithfully that nothing in the world should keep her from coming back. The king caused an escort suitable to her rank to be got ready for her, and she dressed herself splendidly, not forgetting anything that could make her more beautiful. Her chariot was of mother of pearl, drawn by 6 dun-colored griffins just brought from the other side of the world, and she was attended by a number of guards in splendid uniforms, who were all at least 8 feet high and had come from far and near to ride in the princess's train. Miranda reached her father's palace just as the wedding ceremony began, and everyone, as soon as she came in, was struck with surprise at her beauty and the splendor of her jewels. She heard exclamations of admiration on all sides, and the king her father looked at her so attentively that she was afraid he must recognize her, but he was so sure that she was dead that the idea never occurred to him. However, the fear of not getting away made her leave before the marriage was over. She went out hastily, leaving behind her a little coral casket set with emeralds. On it was written in diamond letters, "Jewels for the bride." And when they opened it, which they did as soon as it was found, there seemed to be no end to the pretty things it contained. The king, who had hoped to join the unknown princess and find out who she was dreadfully disappointed when she disappeared so suddenly, and gave orders that if she ever came again, the doors were to be shut, that she might not get away so easily. Short as Miranda's absence had been, it had seemed like 100 years to the king of the sheep. He was waiting for her by a fountain in the thickest part of the forest, and the ground was strewn with splendid presents which he had prepared for her to show his joy and gratitude at her coming back. As soon as she was in sight, he rushed to meet her, leaping and bounding like a real sheep. He caressed her tenderly, throwing himself at her feet and kissing her hands, and told her how uneasy he had been in her absence, and how impatient for her return with an eloquence which charmed her. After some time came the news that the king's second daughter was going to be married. When Miranda heard it, she begged the king of the sheep to allow her to go and see the wedding as before. This request made him feel very sad, as if some misfortune must surely come of it. But his love for the princess being stronger than anything else, he did not like to refuse her. "You wish to leave me, princess," said he. "It is my unhappy fate. You are not to blame. I consent to your going, but, believe me, I can give you no stronger proof of my love than by so doing." The princess assured him that she would only stay a very short time, as she had done before, and begged him not to be uneasy, as she would be quite as much grieved if anything detained her as he could possibly be. So, with the same escort, she set out, and reached the palace as the marriage ceremony began. Everybody was delighted to see her. She was so pretty that they thought she must be some fairy princess, and the princes who were there could not take their eyes off her. The king was more glad than anyone else that she had come again, and gave orders that the doors should all be shut and bolted that very minute. When the wedding was all but over, the princess got up quickly, hoping to slip away unnoticed among the crowd. But, to her great dismay, she found every door fastened. She felt more at ease when the king came up to her, and with the greatest respect begged her not to run away so soon, but at least to honor him by staying for the splendid feast which was prepared for the princes and princesses. He led her into a magnificent hall where all the court was assembled, and himself, taking up the golden bowl full of water, he offered it to her that she might dip her pretty fingers into it. At this the princess could no longer contain herself. Throwing herself at the king's feet, she cried out, "My dream has come true after all. You have offered me water to wash my hands on my sister's wedding day, and it has not vexed you to do it." The king recognized her at once. Indeed, he had already thought several times how much like his poor little Miranda she was. "Oh, my dear daughter," he cried, kissing her, "can you ever forget my cruelty? I ordered you to be put to death because I thought your dream portended the loss of my crown. And so it did," he added, "for now your sisters are both married and have kingdoms of their own, and mine shall be for you." So saying, he put his crown on the princess's head and cried, "Long live Queen Miranda!" All the court cried, "Long live Queen Miranda!" after him, and the young queen's 2 sisters came running up and threw their arms round her neck and kissed her 1,000 times. And then there was such a laughing and crying, talking and kissing all at once, and Miranda thanked her father and began to ask after everyone, particularly the captain of the guard, to whom she owed so much. But to her great sorrow she heard that he was dead. Presently they sat down to the banquet, and the king asked Miranda to tell them all that had happened to her since the terrible morning when he had sent the captain of the guard to fetch her. This she did with so much spirit that all the guests listened with breathless interest. But while she was thus enjoying herself with the king and her sisters, the king of the sheep was waiting impatiently for the time of her return, and when it came and went, and no princess appeared, his anxiety became so great that he could bear it no longer. "She is not coming back any more," he cried. "My miserable sheep's face displeases her, and without Miranda, what is this life to me, wretched creature that I am? Oh, cruel Ragotte, my punishment is complete." For a long time he bewailed his sad fate like this, and then, seeing that it was growing dark, and that still there was no sign of the princess, he set out as fast as he could in the direction of the town. When he reached the palace, he asked for Miranda, but by this time everyone had heard the story of her adventure, and did not want her to go back again to the king of the sheep, so they refused sternly to let him see her. In vain he begged and prayed them to let him in. Though his entreaties might have melted hearts of stone, they did not move the guards of the palace, and at last, quite broken-hearted, he fell dead at their feet. In the meantime, the king, who had not the least idea of the sad thing that was happening outside the gate of his palace, proposed to Miranda that she should be driven in her chariot all round the town, which was to be illuminated with thousands and thousands of torches, placed in windows and balconies, and in all the grand squares. But what a sight met her eyes at the very entrance of the palace! There lay her dear, kind sheep, silent and motionless upon the pavement. She threw herself out of the chariot and ran to him, crying bitterly, for she realized that her broken promise had cost him his life, and for a long, long time she was so unhappy that they thought she would have died too. So you see that even a princess is not always happy, especially if she forgets to keep her word, and the greatest misfortunes often happen to people just as they think they have obtained their heart's desires. End of The Wonderful Sheep.
Little Thumb of the Blue Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Blue Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. Little Thumb. There was, once upon a time, a man and his wife, faggot makers by trade, who had several children, all boys. The eldest was but 10 years old, and the youngest only 7. They were very poor, and their 7 children incommoded them greatly, because not one of them was able to earn his bread. That which gave them yet more uneasiness was that the youngest was of a very puny constitution, and scarce ever spoke a word, which made them take that for stupidity, which was a sign of good sense. He was very little, and when born no bigger than one's thumb, which made him be called Little Thumb. The poor child bore the blame of whatsoever was done amiss in the house, and, guilty or not, was always in the wrong. He was, notwithstanding, more cunning, and had a far greater share of wisdom than all his brothers put together, and, if he spake little, he heard and thought the more. There happened now to come a very bad year, and the famine was so great that these poor people resolved to rid themselves of their children. One evening, when they were all in bed and the faggot-maker was sitting with his wife at the fire, he said to her, with his heart ready to burst with grief, "Thou seest plainly that we are not able to keep our children, and I cannot see them starve to death before my face. I am resolved to lose them in the wood tomorrow, which may very easily be done, for while they are busied in tying up faggots, we may run away and leave them, without their taking any notice." "Ah!" cried his wife, "and canst thou thyself have the heart to take thy children out along with thee on purpose to lose them?" In vain did her husband represent to her their extreme poverty. She would not consent to it. She was indeed poor, but she was their mother. However, having considered what a grief it would be to her to see them perish with hunger, she at last consented, and went to bed all in tears. Little Thumb heard every word that had been spoken, for observing, as he lay in his bed, that they were talking very busily, he got up softly and hid himself under his father's stool, that he might hear what they said without being seen. He went to bed again, but not sleep a wink all the rest of the night, thinking on what he had to do. He got up early in the morning and went to the riverside, where he filled his pockets full of small white pebbles, and then returned home. They all went abroad, but Little Thumb never told his brothers one syllable of what he knew. They went into a very thick forest, where they could not another at 10 paces distance. The faggot maker began to cut wood, and the children to gather up the sticks to make faggots. Their father and mother, seeing them busy at their work, got away from them insensibly, and ran away from them all at once, along a byway through the winding bushes. When the children saw they were left alone, they began to cry as loud as they could. Little Thumb let them cry on, knowing very well how to get home again, for, as he came, he took care to drop all along the way the little white pebbles he had in his pockets. Then he said to them, "Be not afraid, brothers. Father and mother have left us here, but I will lead you home again. Only follow me." They did so, and he brought them home by the very same way they came into the forest. They dared not go in, but sat themselves down at the door, listening to what their father and mother were saying. The very moment the faggot maker and his wife reached home, the lord of the manor sent them 10 crowns, which he had owed them a long while, and which they never expected. This gave them new life, for the poor people were almost famished. The faggot maker sent his wife immediately to the butcher's. As it was a long while since they had eaten a bit, she bought thrice as much meat as would sup 2 people. When they had eaten, the woman said, "Alas, where are now our poor children? They would make a good feast of what we have left here, but it was you, William, who had a mind to lose them. I told you we should repent of it. What are they now doing in the forest? Alas, dear God, the wolves have probably already eaten them up. Thou art very inhuman thus to have lost thy children." The faggot maker grew at last quite out of patience, for she repeated it above 20 times, that they should repent of it, and that she was in the right of it for so saying. He threatened to beat her if she did not hold her tongue. It was not that the faggot maker was not, perhaps, more vexed than his wife, but that she teased him, and that he was of the humor of a great many others who love wives to speak well, but think those very importunate who are continually doing so. She was half drowned in tears, crying out, "Alas, where are now my children, my poor children?" She spoke this so very loud that the children, who were at the gate, began to cry out all together, "Here we are! Here we are!" She ran immediately to open the door, and said, hugging them, "I am glad to see you, my dear children. You are very hungry and weary, and my poor Peter, thou art horribly bemired. Come in, and let me clean thee." Now you must know that Peter was her eldest son, whom she loved above all the rest, because he was somewhat carroty, as she herself was. They sat down to supper, and ate with such a good appetite as pleased both father and mother, whom they acquainted how frightened they were in the forest, speaking almost always all together. The good folks were extremely glad to see their children once more at home, and this joy continued while 10 crowns lasted, but when the money was all gone, they fell again into their former uneasiness, and resolved to lose them again, and, that they might be the surer of doing it, to carry them to a much greater distance than before. They could not talk of this so secretly, but they were overheard by Little Thumb, who made account to get out of this difficulty as well as the former, but, though he got up very early in the morning to go and pick up some little pebbles, he was disappointed, for he found the house door double locked, and was at a stand what to do. When their father had given them each a piece of bread for their breakfast, Little Thumb fancied he might make use of this instead of the pebbles, by throwing it in little bits all along the way they should pass, and so he put the bread in his pocket. Their father and mother brought them into the thickest and most obscure part of the forest, when, stealing away into a bypath, they there left them. Little Thumb was not very uneasy at it, for he thought he could easily find the way again by means of his bread, which he had scattered all along as he came. but he was very much surprised when he could not find so much as one crumb. The birds had come and eaten it up, every bit. They were now in great affliction, for the farther they went, the more they were out of their way, and were more and more bewildered in the forest. Night now came on, and there arose a terribly high wind, which made them dreadfully afraid. They fancied they heard on every side of them the howling of wolves coming to eat them up. They scarce dared to speak or turn their heads. After this it rained very hard, which wetted them to the skin. Their feet slipped at every step they took, and they fell into the mire, whence they got up in a very dirty pickle. Their hands were quite benumbed. Little Thumb climbed to the top of a tree to see if he could discover anything, and having turned his head about on every side, he saw at last a glimmering light, like that of a candle, but a long way from the forest. He came down, and when upon the ground, he could see it no more, which grieved him sadly. However, having walked for some time with his brothers toward that side on which he had seen the light, he perceived it again as he came out of the wood. They came at last to the house where this candle was, and not without an abundance of fear, for very often they lost sight of it, which happened every time they came into a bottom. They knocked at the door, and a good woman came and opened it. She asked them what they would have. Little Thumb told them they were poor children who had been lost in the forest, and desired to lodge there for God's sake. The woman, seeing them so very pretty, began to weep, and said to them, "Alas, poor babies, whither are ye come? Do ye know that this house belongs to a cruel ogre who eats up little children?" "Ah, dear madam," answered Little Thumb, who trembled every joint of him, as well as his brothers, "what shall we do? To be sure the wolves of the forest will devour us tonight if you refuse us to lie here, and so we would rather the gentleman should eat us, and perhaps he might take pity upon us, especially if you please to beg it of him." The ogre's wife, who believed she could conceal them from her husband till morning, let them come in, and brought them to warm themselves at a very good fire, for there was a whole sheep upon the spit, roasting for the ogre's supper. As they began to be a little warm, they heard 3 or 4 great raps at the door. This was the ogre who had come home. Upon this she hid them under the bed and went to open the door. The ogre presently asked if supper was ready, and the wine drawn, and then sat himself down to table. The sheep was as yet all raw and bloody, but he liked it the better for that. He sniffed about to the right and left, saying, "I smell fresh meat." "What you smell so," said his wife, "must be the calf which I have just now killed and flayed."
"I smell fresh meat, I tell thee once more," replied the ogre, looking crossly at his wife, "and there is something here which I do not understand."
As he spoke these words, he got up from the table and went directly to the bed.
Ah, said he, "I see then how thou wouldst cheat me, thou cursed woman. I know not why I do not eat thee up too, but it is well for thee that thou art a tough old carrion. Here is good game which comes very quickly to entertain 3 ogres of my acquaintance, who are to pay me a visit in a day or 2.
With that he dragged them out from under the bed one by one. The poor children fell upon their knees and begged his pardon, but they had to do with one of the most cruel ogres in the world, who, far from having any pity on them, had already devoured them with his eyes, and told his wife they would be delicate eating when tossed up with good savory sauce. He then took a great knife, and coming up to these poor children, whetted it upon a great whetstone which he held in his left hand. He had already taken hold of one of them when his wife said to him, "Why do you need it now? Is it not time enough tomorrow?"
"Hold your prating," said the ogre. "They will eat the tenderer."
"But you have so much meat already," replied his wife. "You have no occasion. Here a calf, 2 sheep, and half a hog."
"That is true," said the Ogre. "Give them their bellyful, that they might not fall away, and put them to bed."
The good woman was overjoyed at this, and gave them a good supper, but they were so much afraid they could not eat a bit. As for the Ogre, he sat down again to drink, being highly pleased that he had got wherewithal to treat his friends. He drank a dozen glasses more than ordinary, which got up into his head and obliged him to go to bed. The Ogre had 7 daughters, all little children, and these young ogresses had all of them very fine complexions, because they used to eat fresh meat like their father, but they had little gray eyes, quite round, hooked noses, and very long sharp teeth, standing at a good distance from each other. They were not as yet over and above mischievous, but they promised very fair for it, for they had already bitten little children, that they might suck their blood. They had been put to bed early, with every one a crown of gold upon her head. There was in the same chamber a bed of the like bigness, and it was into this bed the Ogre's wife put the 7 little boys, after which she went to bed to her husband. Little Thumb, who had observed that the Ogre's daughters had crowns of gold upon their heads, and was afraid lest the Ogre should repent his not killing them, got up about midnight, and, taking his brother's bonnets and his own, went very softly and put them upon the heads of the 7 little ogresses, and having taken off their crowns of gold, which he put upon his own head and his brother's, that the Ogres might take them for his daughters, and his daughters for the little boys whom he wanted to kill. All this succeeded according to his desire, for the Ogre, waking about midnight, and sorry that he deferred to do that till morning which he might have done overnight, threw himself hastily out of bed, and taking his great knife, "Let us see," said he, "how our little rogues do, and not make 2 jobs of the matter." He then went up, groping all the way into his daughter's chamber, and coming to the bed where the little boys lay, who were every soul of them fast asleep, except Little Thumb, who was terribly afraid when he found the Ogre fumbling about his head, as he had done about his brothers. The Ogre, feeling the golden crowns, said, "I should have made a fine piece of work of it, truly. I find I drank too much last night." Then he went to the bed where the girls lay, and having found the boys' little bonnets, "Ah," said he, "my merry lads, are you there? Let us work as we ought." And saying these words, without more ado, he cut the throats of all his 7 daughters. Well pleased with what he had done, he went to bed again to his wife. So soon as Little Thumb heard the Ogre snore, he waked his brother and bade them all put on their clothes presently and follow him. They stole down softly into the garden and got over the wall. They kept running about all night, and trembled all the while without knowing which way they went. The Ogre, when he awoke, said to his wife, "Go upstairs and dress those young rascals who came here last night." The wife was very much surprised at this goodness of her husband, not dreaming after what manner she should dress them, but thinking that he had ordered her to go and put on their clothes, she went up and was strangely astonished when she perceived her 7 daughters killed and weltering in their blood. She fainted away, for this is the first expedient almost all women find in such cases. The Ogre, fearing his wife would be too long in doing what he had ordered, went up himself to help her. He was no less amazed than his wife at this frightful spectacle. "Ah, what have I done?" cried he. "The wretches shall pay for it, and that instantly." He threw a pitcher of water upon his wife's face, and having brought her to herself, said, "Give me quickly my boots of 7 leagues, that I may go and catch them." He went out, and having run over a vast deal of ground, both on this side and that, he came at last into the very road where the poor children were, and not above 100 paces from their father's house. They espied the Ogre, who went at one step from mountain to mountain, and over rivers as easily as the narrowest kennels. Little Thumb, seeing a hollow rock near the place where they were, made his brothers hide themselves in it, and crowded into it himself, minding always what would become of the ogre. The ogre, who found himself much tired with his long and fruitless journey, for these boots of 7 leagues greatly fatigued the wearer, had a great mind to rest himself, and by chance went to sit down upon the rock where the little boys had hid themselves. As it was impossible he could be more weary than he was, he fell asleep, and after reposing himself some time, began to snore so frightfully that the poor children were no less afraid of him than when he held up his great knife and was going to cut their throats. Little Thumb was not so much frightened as his brothers, and told them that they should run away immediately toward home, while the ogre was asleep so soundly, and that they should not be in any pain about him. They took his advice, and got home presently. Little Thumb came up to the ogre, pulled off his boots gently, and put them on his own legs. The boots were very long and large, but, as they were fairies, they had the gift of becoming big and little according to the legs of those who wore them, so that they fitted his feet and legs as well as if they had been made on purpose for him. He went immediately to the ogre's house, where he saw his wife crying bitterly for the loss of the ogre's murdered daughters. "Your husband," said Little Thumb, "is in very great danger, being taken by a gang of thieves, who have sworn to kill him if he does not give them all his gold and silver. The very moment they held their daggers at his throat he perceived me, and desired me to come and tell you the condition he is in, and that you should give me whatsoever he has of value, without retaining any one thing, for otherwise they will kill him without mercy, and, as his case is very pressing, he has desired to make use, you see I have them on, of his boots, that I might make the more haste and show you that I do not impose upon you." The good woman, being sadly frightened, gave him all she had, for this ogre was a very good husband, though he used to eat up little children. Little Thumb, having thus got all the ogre's money, came home to his father's house, where he was received with abundance of joy. There are many people who do not agree in this circumstance, and pretend that Little Thumb never robbed the ogre at all, and that he only thought he might very justly, and with a safe conscience, take off his boots of 7 leagues, because he made no other use of them but to run after little children. These folks affirm that they are very well assured of this, and the more as having drunk and eaten often at the fagot-maker's house. They aver that when Little Thumb had taken off the ogre's boots he went to court, where he was informed that they were very much in pain about a certain army, which was 200 leagues off, and the success of a battle. He went, say they, to the king, and told him that, if he desired it, he would bring him news from the army before night. The king promised him a great sum of money upon that condition. Little Thumb was as good as his word, and returned that very same night with the news, and, this first expedition causing him to be known, he got whatever he pleased, for the king paid him very well for carrying his orders to the army. After having for some time carried on the business of a messenger, he gained thereby great wealth. He went home to his father, where it was impossible to express the joy they were all in at his return. He made the whole family very easy, bought places for his fathers and brothers, and, by that means, settled them very handsomely in the world, and in the meantime made his court to perfection. End of Little Thumb. Recording by Scott Robbins.
The 40 Thieves, from the Blue Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Karen Savage. The Blue Fairy Book, by Andrew Lang. The 40 Thieves. In a town in Persia there dwelt 2 brothers, one named Kasim, the other Ali Baba. Kasim was married to a rich wife and lived in plenty, while Ali Baba had to maintain his wife and children by cutting wood in a neighboring forest and selling it in the town. One day, when Ali Baba was in the forest, he saw a troop of men on horseback coming toward him in a cloud of dust. He was afraid they were robbers, and climbed into a tree for safety. When they came up to him and dismounted, he counted 40 of them. They unbridled their horses and tied them to trees. The finest man among them, whom Ali Baba took to be their captain, went a little way among some bushes and said, "Open sesame," so plainly that Ali Baba heard him. Footnote: Sesame is a kind of grain. End footnote. A door opened in the rocks, and having made the troop go in, he followed them, and the door shut again of itself. They stayed some time inside, and Ali Baba, fearing they might come out and catch him, was forced to sit patiently in the tree. At last the door opened again, and the 40 thieves came out. As the captain went in last, he came out first, and made them all pass by him. He then closed the door, saying, "Shut, Sesame!" Every man bridled his horse and mounted. The captain put himself at their head, and they returned as they came. Then Ali Baba climbed down and went to the door concealed among the bushes, and said, "Open sesame!" and it flew open. Ali Baba, who expected a dull, dismal place, was greatly surprised to find it large and well lighted, hollowed by the hand of man in the form of a vault, which received the light from an opening in the ceiling. He saw rich bales of merchandise, silk, stuff brocades, all piled together, and gold and silver in heaps, and money in leather purses. He went in, and the door shut behind him. He did not look at the silver, but brought out as many bags of gold as he thought his asses, which were browsing outside, could carry, loaded them with the bags, and hid it all with faggots. Using the words, "Shut, Sesame," he closed the door and went home. Then he drove his asses into the yard, shut the gates, carried the money bags to his wife, and emptied them out before her. He bade her keep the secret, and he would go and bury the gold. "Let me first measure it," said his wife. "I will go borrow a measure of someone, while you dig the hole." So she ran to the wife of Cassim and borrowed a measure. Knowing Ali Baba's poverty, the sister was curious to find out what sort of grain his wife wished to measure, and artfully put some suet at the bottom of the measure. Ali Baba's wife went home and set the measure on the heap of gold, and filled it and emptied it often, to her great content. She then carried it back to her sister, without noticing that a piece of gold was sticking to it, which Cassim's wife perceived directly her back was turned. She grew very curious, and said to Cassim when he went home, "Cassim, your brother is richer than you. He does not count his money, he measures it." He begged her to explain this riddle, which she did by showing him the piece of money, and telling him where she had found it. Then Cassim grew so envious that he could not sleep, and went to his brother in the morning before sunrise. "Ali Baba," he said, showing him the gold piece, "you pretend to be poor, and yet you measure gold." By this Ali Baba perceived that through his wife's folly Cassim and his wife knew their secret, so he confessed all, and offered Cassim a share. "That I expect," said Cassim, "but I must know where to find the treasure. Otherwise I will discover all, and you will lose all." Ali Baba, more out of kindness than fear, told him of the cave, and the very words to use. Cassim left Ali Baba, meaning to be beforehand with him, and get the treasure for himself. He rose early next morning, and set out with 10 mules loaded with great chests. He soon found the place, and the door in the rock. He said, "Open sesame," and the door opened and shut behind him. He could have feasted his eyes all day on the treasures, but he now hastened to gather together as much of it as possible. But when he was ready to go, he could not remember what to say for thinking of his great riches. Instead of sesame, he said, "Open barley," and the door remained fast. He named several different sorts of grain, all but the right one, and the door still stuck fast. He was so frightened at the danger he was in that he had as much forgotten the word as if he had never heard it. About noon the robbers returned to their cave, and saw Cassim's mules roving about with great chests on their backs. This gave them the alarm. They drew their sabres and went to the door, which opened on their captain, saying, "Open sesame." Cassim, who had heard the trampling of their horses' feet, resolved to sell his life dearly, so when the door opened he leapt out and threw the captain down. In vain, however, for the robbers with their sabres soon killed him. On entering the cave they saw all the bags laid ready, and could not imagine how anyone had got in without knowing their secret. They cut Cassim's body into 4 quarters, and nailed them up inside the cave in order to frighten anyone who should venture in, and went away in search of more treasure. As night drew on, Cassim's wife grew very uneasy, and ran to her brother-in-law, and told him where her husband had gone. Ali Baba did his best to comfort her, and set out to the forest in search of Cassim. The first thing he saw on entering the cave was his dead brother. Full of horror, he put the body on one of his asses, and bags of gold on the other two, and covering all with some faggots, returned home. He drove the 2 asses laden with gold into his own yard, and led the other to Cassim's house. The door was opened by the slave Morgiana, whom he knew to be both brave and cunning. Unloading the ass, he said to her, "This is the body of your master, who has been murdered, but whom we must bury as though he had died in his bed. I will speak with you again, but now tell your mistress I am come." The wife of Cassim, on learning the fate of her husband, broke out into cries and tears, but Ali Baba offered to take her to live with him and his wife if she would promise to keep his counsel and leave everything to Morgiana, whereupon she agreed and dried her eyes. Morgiana, meanwhile, sought an apothecary and asked him for some lozenges. "My poor master," she said, "can neither eat nor speak, and no one knows what his distemper is." She carried home the lozenges and returned next day, weeping, and asked for an essence only given to those just about to die. Thus in the evening no one was surprised to hear the wretched shrieks and cries of Cassim's wife, and Morgiana telling everyone that Cassim was dead. The day after, Morgiana went to an old cobbler near the gates of the town, who opened his stall early, put a piece of gold in his hand, and bade him follow her with his needle and thread. Having bound his eyes with a handkerchief, she took him to the room where the body lay, pulled off the bandage, and bade him sew the quarters together, after which she covered his eyes again and led him home. Then they buried Cassim, and Morgiana, his slave, followed him to the grave, weeping and tearing her hair, while Cassim's wife stayed at home, uttering lamentable cries. Next day she went to live with Ali Baba, who gave Cassim's shop to his eldest son. The 40 thieves, on their return to the cave, were much astonished to find Cassim's body gone and some of their money-bags. "We are certainly discovered," said the captain, "and shall be undone if we cannot find out who it is that knows our secret. 2 men must have known it. We have killed one, we must now find the other. To this end, one of you who is bold and artful must go into the city dressed as a traveler, and discover whom we have killed, and whether men talk of the strange manner of his death. If the messenger fails, he must lose his life, lest we be betrayed." One of the thieves started up and offered to do this, and after the rest had highly commended him for his bravery, he disguised himself, and happened to enter the town at daybreak, just by Baba Mustapha's stall. The thief bade him good day, saying, "Honest man, how can you possibly see to stitch at your age?" "Old as I am," replied the cobbler, "I have very good eyes, and will you believe me when I tell you that I sewed a dead body together in a place where I had less light than I have now?" The robber was overjoyed at his good fortune, and giving him a piece of gold, desired to be shown the house where he stitched up the dead body. At first Mustapha refused, saying that he had been blindfolded, but when the robber gave him another piece of gold, he began to think he might remember the turnings if blindfolded as before. This means succeeded. The robber partly led him, and was partly guided by him, right in front of Cassim's house, the door of which the robber marked with a piece of chalk. Then, well pleased, he bade farewell to Baba Mustapha, and returned to the forest. By and by, Morgiana, going out, saw the mark the robber had made, quickly guessed that some mischief was brewing, and fetching a piece of chalk, marked 2 or 3 doors on each side, without saying anything to her master or mistress. The thief meantime told his comrades of his discovery. The captain thanked him, and bade him show him the house he had marked. But when they came to it, they saw that 5 or 6 of the houses were chalked in the same manner. The guide was so confounded that he knew not what answer to make, and when they returned he was at once beheaded for having failed. Another robber was dispatched, and having won over Baba Mustapha, marked the house in red chalk. But Morgiana, being again too clever for him, the second messenger was put to death also. The captain now resolved to go himself, but wiser than the others, he did not mark the house, but looked at it so closely that he could not fail to remember it. He returned and ordered his men to go into the neighboring villages and buy 19 mules and 38 leather jars, all empty except one, which was full of oil. The captain put one of his men, fully armed, into each, rubbing the outside of the jars with oil from the full vessel. Then the 19 mules were loaded with 37 robbers in jars and the jar of oil, and reached the town by dusk. The captain stopped his mules in front of Ali Baba's house, and said to Ali Baba, who was sitting outside for coolness, "I have brought some oil from a distance to sell at tomorrow's market, but it is now so late that I know not where to pass the night, unless you will do me the favor to take me in." Though Ali Baba had seen the captain of the robbers in the forest, he did not recognize him in the disguise of an oil merchant. He bade him welcome, opened his gates for the mules to enter, and went to Morgiana to bid her prepare a bed and supper for his guest. He brought the stranger into his hall, and after they had supped, went again to speak to Morgiana in the kitchen, while the captain went into the yard under pretence of seeing after his mules, but really to tell his men what to do. Beginning at the first jar and ending at the last, he said to each man, "As soon as I throw some stones from the window of the chamber where I lie, cut the jars open with your knives, and come out, and I will be with you in a trice." He returned to the house, and Morgiana led him to his chamber. She then told Abdallah, her fellow slave, to set on the pot to make some broth for her master, who had gone to bed. Meanwhile her lamp went out, and she had no more oil in the house. "Do not be uneasy," said Abdallah. "Go into the yard and take some out of one of those jars." Morgiana thanked him for his advice, took the oil pot, and went into the yard. When she came to the first jar, the robber inside said softly, "Is it time?" Any other slave but Morgiana, on finding a man in the jar instead of the oil she wanted, would have screamed and made a noise. But she, knowing the danger her master was in, bethought herself of a plan, and answered quietly, "Not yet, but presently." She went to all the jars, giving the same answer, till she came to the jar of oil. She now saw that her master, thinking to entertain an oil merchant, had let 38 robbers into his house. She filled her oil pot, went back to the kitchen, and having lit her lamp, went again to the oil jar and filled a large kettle full of oil. When it boiled, she went and poured enough oil into every jar to stifle and kill the robber inside. When this brave deed was done, she went back to the kitchen, put out the fire and the lamp, and waited to see what would happen. In a quarter of an hour the captain of the robbers awoke, got up, and opened the window. As all seemed quiet, he threw down some little pebbles which hid the jars. He listened, and as none of his men seemed to stir, he grew uneasy, and went down into the yard. On going to the first jar and saying, "Are you asleep?" he smelt the hot boiled oil, and knew at once that his plot to murder Ali Baba and his household had been discovered. He found all the gang was dead, and missing the oil out of the last jar, became aware of the manner of their death. He then forced the lock of a door leading into a garden, and climbing over several walls, made his escape. Morgiana heard and saw all this, and rejoicing at her success, went to bed and fell asleep. At daybreak Ali Baba arose, and seeing the oil jars still there, asked why the merchant had not gone with his mules. Morgiana bade him look in the first jar and see if there was any oil. Seeing a man, he started back in terror. "Have no fear," said Morgiana. "The man cannot harm you. He is dead." Ali Baba, when he had recovered somewhat from his astonishment, asked what had become of the merchant. "Merchant?" said she. "He is no more a merchant than I am." And she told him the whole story, assuring him that it was a plot of the robbers of the forest, of whom only 3 were left, and that the white and red chalk marks had something to do with it. Ali Baba at once gave Morgiana her freedom, saying that he owed her his life. They then buried the bodies in Ali Baba's garden, while the mules were sold in the market by his slaves. The captain returned to his lonely cave, which seemed frightful to him without his lost companions, and firmly resolved to avenge them by killing Ali Baba. He dressed himself carefully and went into the town, where he took lodgings in an inn. In the course of a great many journeys to the forest, he carried away many rich stuffs and much fine linen, and set up a shop opposite that of Ali Baba's son. He called himself Cogia Hassan, and as he was both civil and well dressed, he soon made friends with Ali Baba's son, and through him with Ali Baba, whom he was continually asking to sup with him. Ali Baba, wishing to return his kindness, invited him into his house, and received him smiling, thanking him for his kindness to his son. When the merchant was about to take his leave, Ali Baba stopped him, saying, "Where are you going, sir, in such haste? Will you not stay and sup with me?" The merchant refused, saying that he had a reason, and on Ali Baba's asking him what that was, he replied, "It is, sir, that I can eat no victuals that have any salt in them." "If that is all," said Ali Baba, "let me tell you that there shall be no salt in either the meat or the bread that we eat tonight." He went to give this order to Morgiana, who was much surprised. "Who is this man," she said, "who eats no salt with his meat?" "He is an honest man, Morgiana," returned her master, "therefore do as I bid you."
But she could not withstand a desire to see this strange man, so she helped Abdallah to carry up the dishes, and saw in a moment that Cogia Hassan was the robber captain, and carried a dagger under his garment. "I am not surprised," she said to herself, "that this wicked man who intends to kill my master will eat no salt with him, but I will hinder his plans." She sent up the supper by Abdallah, while she made ready for one of the boldest acts that could be thought on. When the dessert had been served, Cogia Hassan was left alone with Ali Baba and his son, whom he thought to make drunk and then to murder them. Morgiana, meanwhile, put on a headdress like a dancing girl's, and clasped a girdle round her waist, from which hung a dagger with a silver hilt, and said to Abdallah, "Take your tabor, and let us go and divert our master and his guest." Abdallah took his tabor and played before Morgiana until they came to the door, where Abdallah stopped playing, and Morgiana made a low courtesy. "Come in, Morgiana," said Ali Baba, "and let Cogia Hassan see what you can do." And turning to Cogia Hassan, he said, "She's my slave and my housekeeper." Cogia Hassan was by no means pleased, for he feared that his chance of killing Ali Baba was gone for the present. But he pretended great eagerness to see Morgiana, and Abdallah began to play, and Morgiana to dance. After she had performed several dances, she drew her dagger and made passes with it, sometimes pointing it at her own breast, sometimes at her master's, as if it were part of the dance. Suddenly out of breath, she snatched the tabor from Abdallah with her left hand, and holding the dagger in her right hand, held out the tabor to her master. Ali Baba and his son put a piece of gold into it, and Cogia Hassan, seeing that she was coming to him, pulled out his purse to make her a present, but while he was putting his hand into it, Morgiana plunged the dagger into his heart. "Unhappy girl!" cried Ali Baba and his son. "What have you done to ruin us?" "It was to preserve you, master, not to ruin you," answered Morgiana. "See here," opening the false merchant's garment and showing the dagger. "See what an enemy you have entertained. Remember, he would eat no salt with you, and what more would you have? Look at him. He is both the false oil merchant and the captain of the 40 thieves." Ali Baba was so grateful to Morgiana for thus saving his life that he offered her to his son in marriage, who readily consented, and a few days after the wedding was celebrated with greatest splendor. At the end of a year, Ali Baba, hearing nothing of the 2 remaining robbers, judged they were dead and set out to the cave. The door opened on his saying, "Open, Sesame." He went in and saw that nobody had been there since the captain left it. He brought away as much gold as he could carry and returned to town. He told his son the secret of the cave, which his son handed down in his turn, so the children and grandchildren of Ali Baba were rich to the end of their lives. Footnote: Arabian Nights. End footnote. End of the 40 Thieves.
Hansel and Gretel, from the Blue Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Blue Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. Hansel and Gretel. Once upon a time there dwelt on the outskirts of a large forest a poor woodcutter with his wife and 2 children. The boy was called Hansel, and the girl Gretel. He had always little enough to live on, and once, when there was a great famine in the land, he couldn't even provide them with daily bread. One night, as he was tossing about in bed, full of cares and worry, he sighed and said to his wife, "What's to become of us? How are we to support our poor children, now that we have nothing more for ourselves?" "I'll tell you what, husband," answered the woman. "Early tomorrow morning we'll take the children out into the thickest part of the wood. There we shall light a fire for them, and give them each a piece of bread. Then we'll go on to our work and leave them alone. They won't be able to find their way home, and we shall thus be rid of them." "No, wife," said her husband, "that I won't do. How could I find it in my heart to leave my children alone in the wood? The wild beasts would soon come and tear them to pieces." "Oh, you fool," said she, "then we must all 4 die of hunger, and you may just as well go and plane the boards for our coffins." And she left him no peace till he consented. "But I can't help feeling sorry for the poor children," added the husband. The children, too, had not been able to sleep for hunger, and had heard what their stepmother had said to their father. Gretel wept bitterly and spoke to Hansel. "Now it's all up with us." "No, no, Gretel," said Hansel. "Don't fret yourself. I'll be able to find a way to escape, no fear." And when the old people had fallen asleep, he got up, slipped on his little coat, opened the back door, and stole out. The moon was shining clearly, and the white pebbles which lay in front of the house glittered like bits of silver. Hansel bent down and filled his pocket with as many of them as he could cram in. Then he went back and said to Gretel, "Be comforted, my dear little sister, and go to sleep. God will not desert us." And he lay down in bed again. At daybreak, even before the sun was up, the woman came and woke the two children. "Get up, you lie-a-beds. We're all going to the forest to fetch wood." She gave them each a bit of bread and said, "There's something for your luncheon, but don't you eat it up before, for it's all you'll get." Gretel took the bread under her apron, as Hansel had the stones in his pocket. Then they all set out together on the way to the forest. After they had walked for a little, Hansel stood still and looked back at the house, and this maneuver he repeated again and again. His father observed him and said, "Hansel, what are you gazing at there, and why do you always remain behind? Take care and don't lose your footing." "Oh, father," said Hansel, "I am looking back at my white kitten, which is sitting on the roof, waving me a farewell." The woman exclaimed, "What a donkey you are! That isn't your kitten, that's the morning sun shining on the chimney." But Hansel had not looked back at his kitten, but had always dropped one of the white pebbles out of his pocket onto the path. When they had reached the middle of the forest, the father said, "Now, children, go and fetch a lot of wood, and I'll light a fire that you may not feel cold." Hansel and Gretel heaped up brushwood till they had made a pile nearly the size of a small hill. The brushwood was set fire to, and when the flames leaped high, the woman said, "Now lie down at the fire, children, and rest yourselves. We are going into the forest to cut down wood. When we've finished, we'll come back and fetch you." Hansel and Gretel sat down beside the fire, and at midday ate their little bits of bread. They heard the strokes of the axe, so they thought their father was quite near. But it was no axe they heard, but a bough he had tied on a dead tree and that was blown about by the wind. And when they had sat for a long time, their eyes closed with fatigue, and they fell fast asleep. When they awoke at last, it was pitch dark. Gretel began to cry and said, "How are we ever going to get out of the wood?" But Hansel comforted her. "Wait a bit," he said, "till the moon is up, and then we'll find our way sure enough." And when the full moon had risen, he took his sister by the hand and followed the pebbles, which shone like new threepenny bits, and showed them the path. They walked on through the night, and at daybreak reached their father's house again. They knocked at the door, and when the woman opened it, she exclaimed, "You naughty children, what a time you've slept in the wood! We thought you were never going to come back." But the father rejoiced, for his conscience had reproached him for leaving his children behind by themselves. Not long afterward, there was again great dearth in the land, and the children heard their mother address their father thus in bed one night: "Everything is eaten up once more. We have only half a loaf in the house, and when that's done, it's all up with us. The children must be got rid of, and we'll lead them deeper into the wood this time, so that they won't be able to find their way out again. There is no other way of saving ourselves." The man's heart smote him heavily, and he thought, "Surely it would be better to share the last bite with one's children." But his wife wouldn't listen to his arguments, and did nothing but scold and reproach him. If a man yields once, he's done for, and so, because he had given in the first time, he was forced to do so the second. But the children were awake, and had heard the conversation. When the old people were asleep, Hansel got up and wanted to go out and pick up pebbles again as he had done the first time, but the woman had barred the door, and Hansel couldn't get out. But he consoled his little sister and said, "Don't cry, Gretel, and sleep peacefully, for God is sure to help us." At early dawn, the woman came and made the children get up. They received their bit of bread, but it was even smaller than the time before. On the way to the wood, Hansel crumpled it in his pocket, and every few minutes he stood still and dropped a crumb on the ground. "Hansel, what are you stopping and looking about you for?" said the father. "I'm looking back at my little pigeon, which is sitting on the roof waving me a farewell," answered Hansel. "Fool," said the wife, "that isn't your pigeon, it's the morning sun glittering on the chimney." But Hansel gradually threw all his crumbs on the path. The woman led the children still deeper into the forest, farther than they had ever been in their lives before. Then a big fire was lit again, and the mother said, "Just sit down there, children, and if you're tired you can sleep a bit. We're going into the forest to cut down wood, and in the evening when we're finished we'll come back to fetch you." At midday Gretel divided her bread with Hansel, for he had strewn his all along their path. Then they fell asleep, and evening passed away, but nobody came to the poor children. They didn't wake till it was pitch dark, and Hansel comforted his sister, saying, "Only wait, Gretel, till the moon rises. Then we shall see the breadcrumbs I scattered along the path. They will show us the way back to the house." When the moon appeared, they got up, but they found no crumbs, for the thousands of birds that fly about the woods and fields had picked them all up. "Never mind," said Hansel to Gretel. "You'll see we'll find a way out." But all the same they did not. They wandered about the whole night, and the next day, from morning till evening, but they could not find a path out of the wood. They were very hungry, too, for they had nothing to eat but a few berries they found growing on the ground. And at last they were so tired that their legs refused to carry them any longer, so they lay down under a tree and fell fast asleep. On the third morning after they had left their father's house, they set about their wandering again, but only got deeper and deeper into the wood, and now they felt that if help did not come to them soon they must perish. At midday they saw a beautiful little snow-white bird sitting on a branch, which sang so sweetly that they stopped still and listened to it, and when its song was finished it flapped its wings and flew on in front of them. They followed it, and came to a little house, on the roof of which it perched, and when they came quite near they saw that the cottage was made of bread and roofed with cakes, while the window was made of transparent sugar. "Now we'll set to," said Hansel, "and have a regular blowout. I'll eat a bit of the roof, and you, Gretel, can eat some of the window, which you'll find a sweet morsel." Hansel stretched up his hand and broke off a little bit of the roof to see what it was like, and Gretel went to the casement and began to nibble at it. Thereupon a shrill voice called out from the room inside, "Nibble, nibble, little mouse, who's nibbling my house?" The children answered, "'Tis heaven's own child, the tempest wild," and went on eating, without putting themselves about. Hansel, who thoroughly appreciated the roof, tore down a big bit of it, while Gretel pushed out a whole round window pane and sat down the better to enjoy it. Suddenly the door opened, and an ancient dame leaning on a staff hobbled out. Hansel and Gretel were so terrified that they let what they had in their hands fall. But the old woman shook her head and said, "Oh, you dear children, who led you here? Just come in and stay with me, no ill shall befall you." She took them both by the hand and led them into the house, and laid a most sumptuous dinner before them, milk and sugared pancakes with apples and nuts. After they had finished, 2 beautiful little white beds were prepared for them, and when Hansel and Gretel lay down in them, they felt as if they had got into heaven. The old woman had appeared to be most friendly, but she was really an old witch who had waylaid the children, and had only built the little bread house in order to lure them in. When anyone came into her power, she killed, cooked, and ate him, and held a regular feast day for the occasion. Now witches have red eyes, and cannot see far, but like beasts, they have a keen sense of smell, and know when human beings pass by. When Hansel and Gretel fell into her hands, she laughed maliciously, and said jeeringly, "I've got them now. They shan't escape me." Early in the morning, before the children were awake, she rose up, and when she saw them both sleeping so peacefully, with their round rosy cheeks, she muttered to herself, "That'll be a dainty bite." Then she seized Hansel with her bony hand, and carried him into a little stable, and barred the door on him. He might scream as much as he liked, it did him no good. Then she went to Gretel, shook her till she awoke, and cried, "Get up, you lazy bones! Fetch water and cook something for your brother. When he's fat, I'll eat him up." Gretel began to cry bitterly, but it was of no use. She had to do what the wicked witch bade her. So the best food was cooked for poor Hansel, but Gretel got nothing but crab shells. Every morning the old woman hobbled out to the stable and cried, "Hansel, put out your finger, that I may feel if you are getting fat." But Hansel always stretched out a bone, and the old dame, whose eyes were dim, couldn't see it, and thinking always it was Hansel's finger, wondered why he fattened so slowly. When 4 weeks had passed and Hansel still remained thin, she lost patience and determined to wait no longer. "Hi, Gretel!" she called to the girl. "Be quick and get some water. Hansel may be fat or thin, I'm going to kill him tomorrow and cook him." Oh, how the poor little sister sobbed as she carried the water, and how the tears rolled down her cheeks. "Kind Heaven, help us now!" she cried. "If only the wild beasts in the wood had eaten us, then at least we should have died together." "Just hold your peace," said the old hag. "It won't help you." Early in the morning, Gretel had to go out and hang up the kettle full of water and light the fire. "First we'll bake," said the old dame. "I've heated the oven already and kneaded the dough." She pushed Gretel out to the oven, from which fiery flames were already issuing. "Creep in," said the witch, "and see if it's properly heated, so that we can shove in the bread." For when she had got Gretel in, she meant to close the oven and let the girl bake, that she might eat her up too. But Gretel perceived her intention, and said, "I don't know how I'm to do it. How do I get in?" "You silly goose," said the hag. "The opening is big enough, see? I could get in myself." And she crawled toward it, and poked her head into the oven. Then Gretel gave her a shove that sent her right in, shut the iron door, and drew the bolt. Gracious, how she yelled! It was quite horrible, but Gretel fled, and the wretched old woman was left to perish miserably. Gretel flew straight to Hansel, opened the little stable door, and cried, "Hansel, we are free! The old witch is dead." Then Hansel sprang like a bird out of a cage when the door is opened. How they rejoiced, and fell on each other's necks, and jumped for joy, and kissed one another. And as they had no longer any cause for fear, they went in the old hag's house, and here they found, in every corner of the room, boxes with pearls and precious stones. "These are even better than pebbles," said Hansel, and crammed his pockets full of them. And Gretel said, "I too will bring something home," and she filled her apron full. "But now," said Hansel, "let's go and get well away from the witch's wood." When they had wandered about for some hours, they came to a big lake. "We can't get over," said Hansel. "I see no bridge of any sort or kind." "Yes, and there's no ferry boat either," answered Gretel. "But look, there swims a white duck. If I ask her, she'll help us over." And she called out, "Here are two children, mournful very, seeing neither bridge nor ferry. Take us upon your white back, and row us over, quack, quack." The duck swam toward them, and Hansel got on her back, and bade his little sister sit beside him. "No," answered Gretel, "we should be too heavy a load for the duck. She shall carry us across separately." The good bird did this, and when they were landed safely on the other side, and had gone for a while, the wood became more and more familiar to them, and at length they saw their father's house in the distance. Then they set off to run, and bounding into the room fell on their father's neck. The man had not passed a happy hour since he left them in the wood, but the woman had died. Gretel shook out her apron so that the pearls and precious stones rolled about the room, and Hansel threw down one handful after the other out of his pocket. Thus all their troubles were ended, and they lived happily ever after. My story is done. See, there runs a little mouse. Anyone who catches it may make himself a large fur cap out of it. End of story.
Snow White and Rose Red of the Blue Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. That's LibriVox.org. Recording by Christy Nowak. The Blue Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. Snow White and Rose Red. A poor widow once lived in a little cottage with a garden in front of it, in which grew 2 rose trees, one bearing white roses and the other red. She had 2 children who were just like the 2 rose trees. One was called Snow White and the other Rose Red, and they were the sweetest and best children in the world, always diligent and always cheerful. But Snow White was quieter and more gentle than Rose Red. Rose Red loved to run about the fields and meadows and to pick flowers and catch butterflies, but Snow White sat at home with her mother and helped her in the household, or read aloud to her when there was no work to do. The 2 children loved each other so dearly that they always walked about hand in hand whenever they went out together, and when Snow White said, "We will never desert each other," Rose Red answered, "No, not as long as we live." And the mother added, "Whatever one gets, she shall share with the other." They often roamed about in the woods gathering berries, and no beast offered to hurt them. On the contrary, they came up to them in the most confiding manner. The little hare would eat a cabbage leaf from their hands. The deer grazed beside them. The stag would bound past them merrily, and the birds remained on the branches and sang to them with all their might. No evil ever befell them. If they tarried late in the wood and night overtook them, they lay down together on the moss and slept till morning, and their mother knew they were quite safe, and never felt anxious about them. Once, when they had slept all night in the wood and had been awakened by the morning sun, they perceived a beautiful child in a shining white robe sitting close to their resting place. The figure got up, looked at them kindly but said nothing, and vanished into the wood. And when they looked round about them, they became aware that they had slept quite close to a precipice, over which they would certainly have fallen had they gone on a few steps further in the darkness. And when they told their mother of their adventure, she said what they had seen must have been the angel that guards good children. Snow White and Rose Red kept their mother's cottage so beautifully clean and neat that it was a pleasure to go into it. In summer, Rose Red looked after the house, and every morning, before her mother awoke, she placed a bunch of flowers before the bed, from each tree a rose. In winter, Snow White lit the fire and put on the kettle, which was made of brass, but so beautifully polished that it shone like gold. In the evening, when the snowflakes fell, their mother said, "Snow White, go and close the shutters." And they drew round the fire while the mother put on her spectacles and read aloud from a big book, and the 2 girls listened and sat and span. Beside them on the ground lay a little lamb, and behind them perched a little white dove with its head tucked under its wings. One evening, as they sat thus cozily together, someone knocked at the door as though he desired admittance. The mother said, "Rose Red, open the door quickly. It must be some traveler seeking shelter." Rose Red hastened to unbar the door, and thought she saw a poor man standing in the darkness outside, but it was no such thing, only a bear who poked his thick black head through the door. Rose Red screamed aloud and sprang back in terror. The lamb began to bleat, the dove flapped its wings, and Snow White ran and hid behind her mother's bed. But the bear began to speak and said, "Don't be afraid, I won't hurt you. I'm half frozen, and only wish to warm myself a little." "My poor bear," said the mother, "lie down by the fire. Only take care you don't burn your fur." Then she called out, "Snow White and Rose Red, come out. The bear will do you no harm. He is a good, honest creature." So they both came out of their hiding places, and gradually the lamb and dove drew near too, and they all forgot their fear. The bear asked the children to beat the snow a little out of his fur, and they fetched a brush and scrubbed him till he was dry. Then the beast stretched himself in front of the fire and growled quite happily and comfortably. The children soon grew quite at their ease with him, and led their helpless guest a fearful life. They tugged his fur with their hands, put their small feet on his back and rolled him about here and there, or took a hazel wand and beat him with it, and if he growled, they only laughed. The bear submitted to everything with the best possible good nature. Only when they went too far, he cried, "Oh, children, spare my life! Snow White and Rose Red, don't beat your lover dead!" When it was time to retire for the night, and the others went to bed, the mother said to the bear, "You can lie there on the hearth in heaven's name. It will be shelter for you from the cold and wet." As soon as day dawned, the children let him out, and he trotted over the snow into the wood. From this time on, the bear came every evening at the same hour, and lay down by the hearth and let the children play what pranks they liked with him, and they got so accustomed to him that the door was never shut till their black friend had made his appearance. When spring came and all outside was green, the bear said one morning to Snow White, "Now I must go away, and not return again the whole summer." "Where are you going to, dear bear?" asked Snow White. "I must go to the wood and protect my treasure from the wicked dwarfs. In winter, when the earth is frozen hard, they are obliged to remain underground, for they can't work their way through. But now, when the sun has thawed and warmed the ground, they break through and come up above to spy the land and steal what they can. What once falls into their hands and into their caves is not easily brought back to light." Snow White was quite sad over their friend's departure, and when she unbarred the door for him, the bear, stepping out, caught a piece of his fur in the door-knocker, and Snow White thought she caught sight of glittering gold beneath it, but she couldn't be certain of it, and the bear ran hastily away, and soon disappeared behind the trees. A short time after this, the mother sent the children into the wood to collect faggots. They came in their wanderings upon a big tree which lay felled on the ground, and on the trunk, among the long grass, they noticed something jumping up and down, but what it was they couldn't distinguish. When they approached nearer, they perceived a dwarf with a wizened face and a beard a yard long. The end of the beard was jammed into a cleft of the tree, and the little man sprang about like a dog on a chain, and didn't seem to know what he was to do. He glared at the girls with his fiery red eyes and screamed out, "What are you standing there for? Can't you come and help me?" "What were you doing, little man?" asked Rose Red. "You stupid, inquisitive goose," replied the dwarf. "I wanted to split the tree in order to get the little chips of wood for our kitchen fire. Those thick logs that serve to make fires for coarse, greedy people like yourselves quite burn up all the little food we need. I had successfully driven in the wedge, and all was going well, but the cursed wood was so slippery that it suddenly sprang out, and the tree closed up so rapidly that I had no time to take my beautiful white beard out. So here I am, stuck fast, and I can't get away, and you silly, smooth-faced, milk-and-water girls just stand and laugh. Ugh, what wretches you are!" The children did all in their power, but they couldn't get the beard out. It was wedged in far too firmly. "I will run and fetch somebody," said Rose Red. "Crazy blockheads," snapped the dwarf. "What's the good of calling anyone else? You're already too many for me. Does nothing better occur to you than that?" "Don't be so impatient," said Snow White. "I'll see you get help." And taking her scissors out of her pocket, she cut off the end of his beard. As soon as the dwarf felt himself free, he seized a bag full of gold which was hidden among the roots of the tree, lifted it up, and muttered aloud, "Curse these rude wretches cutting off a piece of my splendid beard." With these words he swung the bag over his back and disappeared without as much as looking at the children again. Shortly after this, Snow White and Rose Red went out to get a dish of fish. As they approached the stream, they saw something which looked like an enormous grasshopper springing toward the water as if it were going to jump in. They ran forward and recognized their old friend the dwarf. "Where are you going to?" asked Rose Red. "You're surely not going to jump into the water." "I'm not such a fool!" screamed the dwarf. "Don't you see that cursed fish is trying to drag me in?" The little man had been sitting on the bank fishing, when unfortunately the wind had entangled his beard in the line, which immediately afterward the big fish bit. The feeble little creature had no strength to pull it out. The fish had the upper fin, and dragged the dwarf toward him. He clung on with all his might to every rush and blade of grass, but it didn't help him much. He had to follow every movement of the fish, and was in great danger of being drawn into the water. The girls came up just at the right moment, held him firm, and did all they could to disentangle his beard from the line, but in vain. Beard and line were in a hopeless muddle. Nothing remained but to produce the scissors and cut the beard, by which a small part of it was sacrificed. When the dwarf perceived what they were about, he yelled to them, "Do you call that manners, you toadstools, to disfigure a fellow's face? It wasn't enough that you shortened my beard before, but you must now needs cut off the best bit of it. I can't appear like this before my own people. I wish you'd been in Jericho first." Then he fetched a sack of pearls that lay among the rushes, and without saying another word he dragged it away and disappeared behind a stone. It happened that soon after this the mother sent the two girls to the town to buy needles, thread, laces, and ribbons. Their road led over a heath where huge boulders of rock lay scattered here and there. While trudging along, they saw a big bird hovering in the air, circling slowly above them, but always descending lower, till at last it settled on a rock not far from them. Immediately afterward they heard a sharp, piercing cry. They ran forward, and saw with horror that the eagle had pounced on their old friend the dwarf, and was about to carry him off. The tender-hearted children seized hold of the little man, and struggled so long with the bird that at last he let go his prey. When the dwarf had recovered from the first shock, he screamed in his screeching voice, "Couldn't you have treated me more carefully? You have torn my thin little coat all to shreds, useless, awkward hussies that you are!" Then he took a bag of precious stones and vanished under the rocks into his cave. The girls were accustomed to his ingratitude, and went on their way and did their business in town. On their way home, as they were again passing the heath, they surprised the dwarf pouring out his precious stones on an open space, for he had thought no one would pass by at so late an hour. The evening sun shone on the glittering stones, and they glanced and gleamed so beautifully that the children stood still and gazed on them. "What are you standing there gaping for?" screamed the dwarf, and his ashen-gray face became scarlet with rage. He was about to go off with these angry words when a sudden growl was heard, and a black bear trotted out of the wood. The dwarf jumped up in great fright, but he hadn't time to reach his place of retreat, for the bear was already close to him. Then he cried in terror, "Dear Mr. Bear, spare me! I'll give you all my treasure. Look at those beautiful precious stones lying there. Spare my life! What pleasure would you get from a poor, feeble little fellow like me? You won't feel me between your teeth. There, lay hold of those two wicked girls. They will be a tender morsel for you, as fat as young quails. Eat them up, for heaven's sake." But the bear, paying no attention to his words, gave the evil little creature one blow with his paw, and he never moved again. The girls ran away, but the bear called after them, "Snow White and Rose Red, don't be afraid. Wait, and I'll come with you." Then they recognized his voice and stood still, and when the bear was quite close to them, his skin suddenly fell off, and a beautiful man stood beside them, all dressed in gold. "I am the king's son," he said, "and have been doomed by that unholy little dwarf who had stolen my treasure to roam about the woods as a wild bear till his death should set me free. Now he has got his well-merited punishment." Snow White married him, and Rose Red his brother, and they divided the great treasure the dwarf had collected in his cave between them. The old mother lived for many years peacefully with her children, and she carried the 2 rose trees with her, and they stood in front of her window, and every year they bore the finest red and white roses. End of Snow White and Rose Red.
The Goose Girl of the Blue Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brett Condren. The Blue Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. The Goose Girl. Once upon a time, an old queen whose husband had been dead for many years had a beautiful daughter. When she grew up, she was betrothed to a prince who lived a great way off. Now when the time drew near for her to be married and to depart into a foreign kingdom, her old mother gave her much costly baggage, and many ornaments, gold and silver, trinkets and knickknacks, and in fact everything that belonged to the royal trousseau, for she loved her daughter very dearly. She gave her a waiting maid also, who was to ride with her and hand her over to the bridegroom, and she provided each of them with a horse for the journey. Now the princess's horse was called Falada, and could speak. When the hour for departure drew near, the old mother went to her bedroom, and taking a small knife she cut her fingers till they bled. Then she held a white rag under them, and letting 3 drops of blood fall into it, she gave it to her daughter, and said, "Dear child, take great care of this rag. It may be of use to you on the journey." So they took a sad farewell of each other, and the princess stuck the rag in front of her dress, mounted her horse, and set forth on the journey to her bridegroom's kingdom. After they had ridden for about an hour, the princess began to feel very thirsty, and said to her waiting maid, "Pray, get down and fetch me some water in my golden cup out of yonder stream. I would like a drink."
"If you're thirsty," said the maid, "dismount yourself and lie down by the water and drink. I don't mean to be your servant any longer."
The princess was so thirsty that she got down, bent over the stream, and drank, for she wasn't allowed to drink out of the golden goblet. As she drank, she murmured, "Oh heaven, what am I to do?" And the 3 drops of blood replied, "If your mother only knew, her heart would surely break in 2." But the princess was meek, and said nothing about her maid's rude behavior, and quietly mounted her horse again. They rode on their way for several miles, but the day was hot, and the sun's rays smote fiercely on them, so that the princess was soon overcome by thirst again. As they passed by a brook, she called once more to her waiting maid, "Pray, get down and give me a drink from my golden cup," for she had long ago forgotten her maid's rude words. But the waiting maid replied, more haughtily than ever before,
"If you want a drink, you can dismount and get it. I don't mean to be your servant."
Then the princess was compelled by her thirst to get down, and bending over the flowing water she cried and said, "Oh heaven, what am I to do?" And the 3 drops of blood replied, "If your mother only knew, her heart would surely break in 2." And as she drank thus, and leaned right over the water, the rag containing the 3 drops of blood fell from her bosom and floated down the stream, and she in her anxiety never even noticed her loss. But the waiting maid had observed it with delight, as she knew it gave her power over the bride, for in losing the drops of blood the princess had become weak and powerless. When she wished to get on her horse Falada again, the waiting maid called out,
"I mean to ride Falada. You must mount my beast."
And this too she had to submit to. Then the waiting maid commanded her harshly to take off her royal robes and put on common ones, and finally she made her swear by heaven not to say a word about the matter when they reached the palace. And if she hadn't taken this oath, she would have been killed on the spot. But Falada observed everything and laid it all to heart. The waiting maid now mounted Falada, and the real bride the worse horse, and so they continued their journey till at length they arrived at the palace yard. There was great rejoicing over the arrival, and the prince sprang forward to meet them, and taking the waiting maid for his bride, he lifted her down from her horse and led her upstairs to the royal chamber. In the meantime, the real princess was left standing below in the courtyard. The old king, who was looking out of his window, beheld her in this plight, and it struck him how sweet and gentle, even beautiful, she looked. He went at once to the royal chamber and asked the bride who it was she had brought with her, and had left thus standing in the court below.
"Oh," replied the bride, "I brought her with me to keep me company on the journey. Give the girl something to do, that she may not be idle."
But the old king had no work for her, and couldn't think of anything, so he said, "I've a small boy who looks after the geese. She'd better help him." The youth's name was Curdken, and the real bride was made to assist him in herding geese. Soon after this the false bride said to the prince,
"Dearest husband, I pray you grant me a favor."
He answered, "That I will."
"Then let the slaughterer cut off the head of the horse I rode here upon, because it behaved very badly on the journey."
But the truth was she was afraid lest the horse should speak and tell how she had treated the princess. She carried her point, and the faithful Falada was doomed to die. When the news came to the ears of the real princess, she went to the slaughterer and secretly promised him a piece of gold if he would do something for her. There was in the town a large dark gate through which she had to pass night and morning with the geese. Would he kindly hang up Falada's head there, that she might see it once again? The slaughterer said he would do as she desired, chopped off the head, and nailed it firmly over the gateway. Early the next morning, as she and Curdken were driving their flock through the gate, she said as she passed under, "O Falada, 'tis you hang there?" And the head replied, "'Tis you. Pass under, princess fair. If your mother only knew, her heart would surely break in two." And she left the tower and drove the geese into a field. And when they had reached the common where the geese fed, she sat down and unloosed her hair, which was of pure gold. Curdken loved to see it glitter in the sun, and wanted much to pull some hair out. Then she spoke, "Wind, wind, gently sway, blow Curdken's hat away, let him chase o'er field and wold, till my locks of ruddy gold, now astray and hanging down, be combed and plaited in a crown." Then a gust of wind blew Curdken's hat away, and he had to chase it over hill and dale. When he returned from the pursuit, she had finished her combing and curling, and his chance of getting any hair was gone. Curdken was very angry and wouldn't speak to her, so they herded the geese till the evening and then went home. The next morning, as they passed under the gate, the girl said, "O Falada, 'tis you hang there?" And the head replied, "'Tis you pass under, princess fair. If your mother only knew, her heart would surely break in two." Then she went on her way till she came to the common, where she sat down and began to comb out her hair. Then Curdken ran up to her and wanted to grasp some of the hair from her head, but she called out hastily, "Wind, wind, gently sway, blow Curdken's hat away, let him chase o'er field and wold, till my locks of ruddy gold, now astray and hanging down, be combed and plaited in a crown." Then a puff of wind came and blew Curdken's hat far away, so that he had to run after it. And when he returned, she had long finished putting up her golden locks, and he couldn't get any hair, so they watched the geese till it was dark. But that evening, when they got home, Curdken went to the old king and said, "I refuse to herd geese any longer with that girl." "For what reason?" asked the old king. "Because she does nothing but annoy me all day long," replied Curdken, and he proceeded to relate all her iniquities, and said, "Every morning as we drive the flock through the dark gate, she says to a horse's head that hangs on the wall, 'O Falada, 'tis you hang there?' And the head replies, "'Tis you pass under, princess fair. If your mother only knew, her heart would surely break in two." And Curdken went on to tell what passed on the common where the geese fed, and how he had always to chase his hat. The old king bade him go and drive forth his flock as usual the next day. And when morning came, he himself took up his position behind the dark gate, and heard how the goose girl greeted Falada. Then he followed her through the field, and hid himself behind a bush on the common. He soon saw with his own eyes how the goose boy and goose girl looked after the geese, and how after a time the maiden sat down and loosed her hair, that glittered like gold, and repeated, "Wind, wind, gently sway, blow Curdken's hat away, let him chase o'er field and wold, till my locks of ruddy gold, now astray and hanging down, be combed and plaited in a crown." Then a gust of wind came and blew Curdken's hat away, so that he had to fly over hill and dale after it, and the girl, in the meantime, quietly combed and plaited her hair. All this the old king observed, and returned to the palace without anyone having noticed him. In the evening, when the goose girl came home, he called her aside, and asked her why she behaved as she did. "I may not tell you why. How dare I confide my woes to anyone? For I swore not to, by heaven, otherwise I should have lost my life." The old king begged her to tell him all, and left her no peace, but when he could get nothing out of her, at last he said, "Well, if you won't tell me, confide your trouble to the iron stove there." And he went away. And she crept to the stove, and began to sob and cry, and to pour out her poor little heart, and said, "Here I sit, deserted by all the world. I, who am a king's daughter, and a false waiting maid, has forced me to take off my own clothes, and has taken my place with my bridegroom, while I have to fulfill the lowly office of goose girl. If my mother only knew, her heart would surely break in two." But the old king stood outside at the stove chimney and listened to her words. Then he entered the room again, and bidding her leave the stove, he ordered royal apparel to be put on her, in which she looked amazingly lovely. Then he summoned his son, and revealed to him that he had got the false bride, who was nothing but a waiting maid, while the real one, in the guise of the ex-goose girl, was standing at his side. The young king rejoiced from his heart when he saw her beauty, and learned how good she was, and a great banquet was prepared, to which everyone was bidden. The bridegroom sat at the head of the table, the princess on one side of him, and the waiting maid on the other side, but she was so dazzled that she did not recognize the princess in her glittering garments. Now when they had eaten and drunk, and were merry, the old king asked the waiting maid to solve a knotty point for him. What, he said, should be done to a certain person who has deceived everyone? And he proceeded to relate the whole story, ending with, "Now what sentence should be passed?" Then the false bride answered,
She deserves to be put stark naked into a barrel lined with sharp nails, which should be dragged by 2 white horses up and down the street till she is dead.
"You are the person," said the king, "and you have passed sentence on yourself, and even so shall it be done to you." And when the sentence had been carried out, the young king was married to his real bride, and both reigned over the kingdom in peace and happiness. End of The Goose Girl.
Toads and Diamonds of the Blue Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Blue Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. Toads and Diamonds. There was once upon a time a widow who had 2 daughters. The eldest was so much like her in the face and humor that whoever looked upon the daughter saw the mother. They were both so disagreeable and so proud that there was no living with them. The youngest, who was the very picture of her father for courtesy and sweetness of temper, was withal one of the most beautiful girls ever seen. As people naturally love their own likeness, this mother even doted on her eldest daughter, and at the same time had a horrible aversion for the youngest. She made her eat in the kitchen and work continually. Among other things, this poor child was forced twice a day to draw water above 1.5 miles off the house, and bring home a pitcher full of it. One day, as she was at this fountain, there came to her a poor woman, who begged of her to let her drink. "Oh, aye, with all my heart, goody," said this pretty little girl, and rinsing immediately the pitcher, she took up some water from the clearest place of the fountain, and gave it to her, holding up the pitcher all the while, that she might drink the easier. The good woman, having drunk, said to her, "You are so very pretty, my dear, so good and so mannerly, that I cannot help giving you a gift." For this was a fairy, who had taken the form of a poor country woman, to see how far the civility and good manners of this pretty girl would go. "I will give you for a gift," continued the fairy, "that, at every word you speak, there shall come out of your mouth either a flower or a jewel." When this pretty girl came home, her mother scolded her for staying so long at the fountain. "I beg your pardon, mamma," said the poor girl, "for not making more haste." And in speaking these words, there came out of her mouth 2 roses, 2 pearls, and 2 diamonds. "What is it I see there?" said the mother, quite astonished. "I think I see pearls and diamonds come out of the girl's mouth. How happens this, child?" This was the first time she had ever called her child. The poor creature told her frankly all the matter, not without dropping out infinite numbers of diamonds. "In good faith," cried the mother, "I must send my child thither. Come hither, family. Look what comes out of thy sister's mouth when she speaks. Wouldst not thou be glad, my dear, to have the same gift given to thee? Thou hast nothing else to do but to go and draw water out of the fountain, and when a certain poor woman asks you to let her drink, to give it to her very civilly." "It will be a very fine sight indeed," said this ill-bred minx, "to see me go draw water." "You shall go, hussy," said the mother, "and this minute." So away she went, but grumbling all the way, taking with her the best silver tankard in the house. She was no sooner at the fountain than she saw coming out of the wood a lady most gloriously dressed, who came up to her and asked to drink. This was, you must know, the very fairy who appeared to her sister, but now had taken the air and dress of a princess, to see how far this girl's rudeness would go. "Am I come hither," said the proud, saucy one, "to serve you with water, pray? I suppose the silver tankard was brought purely for your ladyship, was it? However, you may drink out of it, if you have a fancy." "You are not over and above mannerly," answered the fairy, without putting herself in a passion. "Well then, since you have so little breeding, and are also so disobliging, I give for you a gift that at every word you speak there shall come out of your mouth a snake or a toad." So soon as her mother saw her coming, she cried out, "Well, daughter?" "Well, mother," answered the pert hussy, throwing out of her mouth 2 vipers and 2 toads. "Oh, mercy!" cried the mother, "what is it I see? Oh, it is that wretch her sister who has occasioned all this, but she shall pay for it." And immediately she ran to beat her. The poor child fled away from her and went to hide herself in the forest, but not far from thence. The king's son, then on his return from hunting, met her, and seeing her so very pretty, asked her what she did there alone and why she cried. "Alas, sir, my mamma has turned me out of doors." The king's son, who saw 5 or 6 pearls and as many diamonds come out of her mouth, desired her to tell him how that happened. She thereupon told him the whole story, and so the king's son fell in love with her, and, considering himself that such a gift was worth more than any marriage portion, conducted her to the palace of the king his father, and there married her. As for the sister, she made herself so much hated that her own mother turned her off, and the miserable wretch, having wandered about a good while without finding anybody to take her in, went to a corner of the wood, and there died. Footnote: written by Charles Perrault.
Prince Darling of the Blue Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avery. Once upon a time there lived a king who was so just and kind that his subjects called him the Good King. It happened one day when he was out hunting that a little white rabbit, which his dogs were chasing away, sprang into his arms for shelter. The king stroked it gently and said to it, "Well, Bunny, as you have come to me for protection, I will see that nobody hurts you." And he took it home to his palace and had it put in a pretty little house with all sorts of nice things to eat. That night, when he was alone in his room, a beautiful lady suddenly appeared before him. Her long dress was as white as snow, and she had a crown of white roses upon her head. The good king was very much surprised to see her, for he knew his door had been tightly shut, and he could not think how she had got in. But she said to him, "I am the Fairy Truth. I was passing through the wood when you were out hunting, and I wished to see if you were really good, as everybody said you were. So I took the shape of a little rabbit to come to your arms for shelter, for I knew that those who are merciful to animals will be still kinder to their fellow men. If you had refused to help me, I should have been certain that you were wicked. I thank you for the kindness you have shown me, which has made me your friend forever. You have only to ask me anything you want, and I promise that I will give it to you." "Madam," said the good king, "since you are a fairy, you no doubt know all my wishes. I have but one son whom I love very dearly. That is why he is called Prince Darling. If you are really good enough to wish to do me a favor, I beg that you will become his friend." "With all my heart," answered the fairy. "I can make your son the handsomest prince in the world, or the richest, or the most powerful. Choose whichever you like for him." "I do not ask either of these things for my son," replied the good king, "but if you will make him the best of princes, I shall indeed be grateful to you. What good would it do to him to be rich or handsome, or to possess all the kingdoms of the world, if he were wicked? You know well he would still be unhappy. Only a good man can be really contented." "You are quite right," answered the fairy, "but it is not in my power to make Prince Darling a good man, unless he will help me. He must himself try hard to become good. I can only promise to give him good advice, to scold him for his faults, and to punish him if he will not correct and punish himself." The good king was quite satisfied with this promise, and very soon afterward he died. Prince Darling was very sorry, for he loved his father with all his heart, and he would willingly have given all his kingdoms and all his treasures of gold and silver if they could have kept the good king with him. 2 days afterward, when the prince had gone to bed, the fairy suddenly appeared to him and said, "I promised your father that I would be your friend, and to keep my word I have come to bring you a present." At the same time she put a little gold ring upon his finger. "Take great care of this ring," she said. "It is more precious than diamonds. Every time you do a bad deed it will prick your finger. But if, in spite of its pricking, you go on your own evil way, you will lose my friendship, and I shall become your enemy." So saying, the fairy disappeared, leaving Prince Darling very much astonished. For some time he behaved so well that the ring never pricked him, and that he was so contented that his subjects called him Prince Darling the Happy. One day, however, he went out hunting, but could get no sport, which put him in a very bad temper. It seemed to him as he rode along that his ring was pressing into his finger, but as it did not prick him, he did not heed it. When he got home and went to his own room, his little dog Bibi ran to meet him, jumping round him with pleasure. "Get away," said the prince quite gruffly. "I don't want you. You are in the way." The poor little dog, who didn't understand this at all, pulled at his coat to make him at least look at her, and this made Prince Darling so cross that he gave her quite a hard kick. Instantly his ring pricked him sharply, as it had been a pin. He was very much surprised, and sat down in a corner of his room feeling quite ashamed of himself. "I believe the fairy is laughing at me," he thought. "Surely I can have done no great wrong in just kicking a tiresome animal. What is the good of my being ruler of a great kingdom if I am not even allowed to beat my own dog?" "I am not making fun of you," said a voice, answering Prince Darling's thoughts. "You have committed 3 faults. First of all, you were out of temper because you could not have what you wanted, and you thought all men and animals were only made to do your pleasure. Then you were really angry, which is very naughty indeed, and lastly, you were cruel to a poor little animal, who did not in the least deserve to be ill-treated. I know you are far above a little dog, but if it were right and allowable that great people should ill-treat all those who were beneath them, I might at this moment beat you or kill you, for a fairy is greater than a man. The advantage of possessing a great empire is not to be able to do the evil that one desires, but to do all the good that one possibly can." The prince saw how naughty he had been, and promised to try and do better in the future, but he did not keep his word. The fact was, he had been brought up by a foolish nurse, who had spoiled him when he was little. If he wanted anything, he only had to cry and fret and stamp his feet, and she would give him whatever he asked for, which had made him self-willed. Also she had told him from morning to night that he would one day be a king, and that kings were very happy, because everyone was bound to obey and respect them, and no one could prevent them from doing just as they wanted. When the prince grew old enough to understand, he soon learned that there could be nothing worse than to be proud, obstinate, and conceited, and he had really tried to cure himself of these defects. But by that time all his faults had become habits, and a bad habit is very hard to get rid of. Not that he was naturally of a bad disposition. He was truly sorry when he had been naughty, and said, "I am very unhappy to have to struggle against my anger and pride every day. If I had been punished for them when I was little, they would not be such a trouble to me now." His ring pricked him very often, but sometimes he left off what he was doing at once, but at other times he would not attend to it. Strangely enough, it gave him only a slight prick for trifling fault, but when he was really naughty, it made his finger actually bleed. At last he got tired of being constantly reminded, and wanted to be able to do as he liked, so he threw his ring aside, and thought himself the happiest of men to have got rid of its teasing pricks. He gave himself up to doing every foolish thing that occurred to him, until he became quite wicked, and nobody could like him any longer. One day, when the prince was walking about, he saw a young girl who was so very pretty that he made up his mind at once that he would marry her. Her name was Celia, and she was as good as she was beautiful. Prince Darling fancied that Celia would think herself only too happy if he offered to make her a great queen, but she said fearlessly, "Sire, I am only a shepherdess, and a poor girl, but nevertheless I will not marry you." "Do you dislike me?" asked the prince, who was very much vexed at this answer. "No, my prince," replied Celia, "I cannot help thinking you very handsome, but what good would riches be to me, and all the grand dresses and splendid carriages that you would give me, if the bad deeds which I should see you do every day made me hate and despise you?" The prince was very angry at this speech, and commanded his officers to make Celia a prisoner and carry her off to his palace. All day long the remembrance of what she had said annoyed him, but as he loved her, he could not make up his mind to have her punished. One of the prince's favorite companions was his foster brother, whom he trusted entirely, but he was not at all a good man, and gave Prince Darling very bad advice, and encouraged him in all his evil ways. When he saw the prince so downcast, he asked what was the matter, and when he explained that he could not bear Celia's bad opinion of him, and was resolved to be a better man, in order to please her, this evil adviser said to him, "You are very kind to trouble yourself about this little girl. If I were you, I would soon make her obey me. Remember that you are a king, and that it would be laughable to see you trying to please a shepherdess, who ought to be only too glad to be one of your slaves. Keep her in prison, and feed her on bread and water for a little while, and then, if she still says she will not marry you, have her head cut off, to teach other people that you mean to be obeyed. Why, if you cannot make a girl like that do as you wish, your subjects will soon forget that they are only put on this world for our pleasure." "But," said Prince Darling, "would it not be a shame if I had an innocent girl put to death? For Celia has done nothing to deserve punishment." "If people will not do as you tell them, they ought to suffer for it," answered his foster brother. "But even if it were unjust, you had better be accused of that by your subjects than that they should find out that they may insult and thwart you as soon as they please." In saying this, he was touching a weak point in his brother's character, for the prince's fear of losing any of his power made him at once abandon his first idea of trying to be good, and resolved to try and frighten the shepherdess into consenting to marry him. His foster brother, who wanted him to keep this resolution, invited 3 young courtiers, as wicked as himself, to sup with the prince, and they persuaded him to drink a great deal of wine, and continued to excite his anger against Celia by telling him that she had laughed at his love for her, until at last, in quite a furious rage, he rushed off to find her, declaring that if she still refused to marry him, she should be sold as a slave the very next day. But when he reached the room in which Celia had been locked up, he was greatly surprised to find that she was not in it, though he had the key in his own pocket all the time. His anger was terrible, and he vowed vengeance against whoever had helped her escape. His bad friends, when they heard him, resolved to turn his wrath upon an old nobleman who had formerly been his tutor, and who still dared sometimes to tell the prince of his faults, for he loved him as if he had been his own son. At first Prince Darling had thanked him, but after a time he grew impatient, and thought it must be just mere love of fault-finding that made his old tutor blame him when everyone else was praising and flattering him. So he ordered him to retire from his court, though he still from time to time spoke of him as a worthy man whom he respected, even if he no longer loved him. His unworthy friends feared that he might some day take it into his head to recall his old tutor, so they thought now a good opportunity of getting him banished forever. They reported to the prince that Suleiman, for that was the tutor's name, had boasted of having helped Celia to escape, and they bribed 3 men to say that Suleiman himself had told them about it. The prince, in great anger, sent his foster brother with a number of soldiers to bring his tutor before him, in chains, like a criminal. After giving this order he went to his own room, but he had scarcely got into it when there was a clap of thunder, which made the ground shake, and the fairy Truth appeared suddenly before him. "I promised your father," said she sternly, "to give you good advice, and to punish you if you refuse to follow it. You have despised my counsel, and have gone your own evil way, until you are not outwardly a man. Really you are a monster, the horror of everyone who knows you. It is time that I should fulfill my promise, and begin your punishment. I condemn you to resemble the animals whose ways you have imitated. You have made yourself like the lion by your anger, and like the wolf by your greediness. Like a snake, you have ungratefully turned upon those who would be a second father to you. Your churlishness has made you a bull. Therefore, in your new form, take the appearance of all these animals." The fairy had scarcely finished speaking when the Prince Darling saw to his horror that her words were fulfilled. He had a lion's head, a bull's horns, a wolf's feet, and a snake's body. At the same instant he found himself in a great forest, beside a clear lake, in which he could see plainly the horrible creature he had become, and a voice said to him, "Look carefully at the state to which your wickedness has brought you. Believe me, your soul is 1,000 times more hideous than your body." Prince Darling recognized the voice of the fairy Truth, and turned in a fury to catch her and eat her up if he possibly could. But he saw no one, and the same voice went on, "I laugh at your powerlessness and anger, and I intend to punish your pride by letting you fall into the hands of your own subjects." The prince began to think that the best thing he could do would be to get as far away from the lake as he could. Then at least he would not be continually reminded of his terrible ugliness. So he ran toward the wood, but before he had gone many yards he fell into a deep pit which had been made to trap bears, and the hunters, who were hiding in a tree, leapt down and secured him with several chains, and led him into the chief city of his own kingdom. On the way, instead of recognizing that his own faults had brought this punishment upon him, he accused the fairy of being the cause of all his misfortunes, and bit and tore at his chains furiously. As they approached the town he saw that some great rejoicing was being held, and when the hunters asked what had happened, they were told that the prince, whose only pleasure it was to torment his people, had been found in his room, killed by a thunderbolt, for that was what had supposed to become of him. 4 of his courtiers, those who had encouraged him in his wicked doings, had tried to seize the kingdom and divide it between them, but the people, who knew it was their bad counsels which had so changed their prince, had cut off their heads, and had offered the crown to Suliman, whom the prince had left in prison. This noble lord had just been crowned, and the deliverance of the kingdom was the cause of the rejoicing. For, they said, he is a good and just man, and we shall once more enjoy peace and prosperity. Prince Darling roared with anger when he heard this, but it was still worse for him when he reached the great square before his own palace. He saw Suliman seated upon a magnificent throne, and all the people crowded around him, wishing him a long life that he might undo all the mischief done by his predecessor. Presently Suliman made a sign with his hand that the people should be silent, and said, "I have accepted the crown you have offered me, but only that I may keep it for Prince Darling, who is not dead as you suppose. The fairy has assured me that there is still hope that you may one day see him again, good and virtuous as he was when he first came to the throne. Alas," he continued, "he was led away by flatterers. I knew his heart, and am certain that if it had not been for the bad influence on those who surrounded him, he would have been a good king and a father to his people. We may hate his faults, but let us pity him and hope for his restoration. As for me, I would die gladly if that would bring back our prince to reign justly and worthily once more." These words went to Prince Darling's heart. He realized the true affection and faithfulness of his old tutor, and for the first time reproached himself for all his evil ways. At the same instant he felt his anger melting away, and began quickly to think over his past life, and to admit that his punishment was not more than he had deserved. He left off tearing at the iron bars of the cage in which he was shut up, and became as gentle as a lamb. The hunters who had caught him took him to a great menagerie, from where he was chained up among the other wild beasts, and he was determined to show his sorrow for his past bad behavior by being gentle and obedient to the man who had to take care of him. Unfortunately, this man was very rough and unkind, and though the poor monster was quite quiet, he often beat him without rhyme or reason when he happened to be in a bad temper. One day, when this keeper was asleep, a tiger broke its chain and flew at him to eat him up. Prince Darling, who saw that this was going on, at first felt quite pleased to think that he should soon be delivered from his persecutor, but soon thought better of it and wished that he were free. "I would return good for evil," he said to himself, "and save the unhappy man's life." He had hardly wished this when his iron cage flew open, and he rushed to the side of the keeper, who was awake and was defending himself against the tiger. When he saw the monster had got out, he gave himself up for lost, but his fear was soon changed into joy, for the kind monster flew itself upon the tiger, and very soon killed it, and then came and crouched at the feet of the man it had saved. Overcome with gratitude, the keeper stood to caress the strange creature which had done him such a great service. But suddenly a voice said in his ear, "A good action should never go unrewarded," and at the same instant the monster disappeared, and he saw at his feet only a pretty little dog. Prince Darling, delighted by this change, frisked about the keeper, showing his joy in every way he could, and the man, taking him up in his arms, carried him to the king, to whom he told the whole story. The queen said that she would like to have this wonderful little dog, and the prince would have been very happy in his new home if he could have forgotten that he was a man and a king. The queen petted and took care of him, but she was so afraid that he would get too fat that she consulted the court physician, who said that he was to be fed only upon bread, and was not to have much even of that. So poor Prince Darling was terribly hungry all day long, but he was very patient about it. One day, when they gave him his little loaf for breakfast, he thought he would like to eat it out in the garden. So he took it up in his mouth and trotted away towards a brook he knew of a long way from the palace. But he was surprised to find that the brook was gone, and where it had been stood a great house that seemed to be built of gold and precious stones. Numbers of people splendidly dressed were going into it, and sounds of music and dancing and feasting could be seen from the windows. But what seemed very strange was that those people who came out of the house were pale and thin, and their clothes were torn and hanging in rags about them. Some fell down dead as they came out before they had time to get away. Others crawled farther with great difficulty, while others lay again on the ground, fainting with hunger, and begged a morsel of bread from those who were going into the house, but they would not so much as look at the poor creatures. Prince Darling went up to a young girl who was trying to eat a few blades of grass, she was so hungry. Touched with compassion, he said to himself, "I am very hungry, but I shall not die of starvation before I get to my dinner. If I give my breakfast to this poor creature, perhaps I may save her life." So he laid his piece of bread in the girl's hand, and saw her eat it up eagerly. She soon seemed to be quite well again, and the prince, delighted to have been able to help her, was thinking of going home to the palace, when he heard a great outcry, and turning around, saw Celia, who was being carried against her will into the great house. For the first time the prince regretted that he was no longer the monster. Then he would have been able to rescue Celia. Now he could only bark feebly at the people, who were carrying her off, and try to follow them, but they chased and kicked him away. He determined not to quit the place until he knew what had become of Celia, and blamed himself for what had befallen her. "Alas," he said to himself, "I am furious with the people that are carrying Celia off, but isn't that exactly what I did myself? And had I not been prevented, did I not intend to be still more cruel to her?" Here he was interrupted by a noise above his head. Someone was opening a window, and he saw with delight that it was Celia herself, who came forward and threw out a plate of most delicious-looking food. Then the window was shut again, and the Prince Darling, who had not had anything to eat all day, thought he might as well take the opportunity of getting something. He ran forward again, but the young girl to whom he had given his bread gave a cry of terror, and took him up in her arms, saying, "Don't touch it, my poor little dog. That house is the palace of pleasure, and everything that comes out of it is poisoned." At the same moment a voice said, "You see, a good action always brings its reward," and the prince found himself changed into a beautiful white dove. He remembered that white was the favorite color of the fairy Truth, and began to hope that he might at last win back her favor. But just now his first care was for Celia, and rising into the air he flew round and round the house until he saw an open window. But he searched through every room in vain. No trace of Celia was to be seen, and the prince, in despair, determined to search through the world till he found her. He flew on and on for several days, till he came to a great desert, where he saw a cavern, and to his delight there sat Celia, sharing the simple breakfast of an old hermit. Overjoyed to have found her, Prince Darling perched upon her shoulder, trying to express by his caresses how glad he was to see her again, and Celia, surprised and delighted by the tameness of this pretty white dove, stroked it softly, and said, though she never thought of its understanding her, "I accept the gift that you made me of yourself, and I will love you always." "Take care what you are saying, Celia," said the old hermit. "Are you prepared to keep that promise?" "Indeed I hope so, my sweet shepherdess," cried out the prince, who was at that moment restored to his natural shape. "You promised to love me always. Tell me that you really mean what you said, or I shall have to ask the fairy to give me back the form of the dove, which pleased you so much." "You need not be afraid that she will change her mind," said the fairy, throwing off the hermit's robe in which she had been disguised, and appearing before them. "Celia has loved you ever since she first saw you, only she would not tell you while you were so obstinate and naughty. Now you have repented, and mean to be good, as you deserve to be happy, and so she may love you so much as she likes." Celia and Prince Darling threw themselves at the fairy's feet, and the prince was never tired of thanking her for her kindness. Celia was delighted to hear how sorry he was for all his past follies and misdeeds, and promised to love him as long as she lived. "Rise, my children," said the fairy, "and I will transport you to the palace, and Prince Darling shall have back again the crown he forfeited by his bad behavior." While she was speaking, they found themselves in Suliman's hall, and his delight was great at seeing his dear master once more. He gave up the throne joyfully to the prince, and remained always the most faithful of his subjects. Celia and Prince Darling reigned for many years, but he was so determined to govern worthily and to do his duty that his ring, which he took to wearing again, never once pricked him severely. End of Prince Darling.
Bluebeard of the Blue Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by Sarah Jennings. The Blue Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. Bluebeard. There was a man who had fine houses, both in town and country, a deal of silver and gold plate, embroidered furniture, and coaches gilded all over with gold. But this man was so unlucky as to have a blue beard, which made him so frightfully ugly that all the women and girls ran away from him. One of his neighbours, a lady of quality, had 2 daughters who were perfect beauties. He desired of her one of them in marriage, leaving to her choice which of the 2 she would bestow on him. They would neither of them have him, and sent him backward and forward from one another, not being able to bear the thoughts of marrying a man who had a blue beard. And what besides gave them disgust and aversion was his already having been married to several wives, and nobody ever knew what became of them. Bluebeard, to engage their affection, took them with the lady their mother and 3 or 4 ladies of their acquaintance, with other young people of the neighbourhood, to one of his country seats, where they stayed a whole week. There was nothing then to be seen but parties of pleasure, hunting, fishing, dancing, mirth, and feasting. Nobody went to bed, but all passed the night in rallying and joking with each other. In short, everything succeeded so well that the youngest daughter began to think the master of the house not to have a beard so very blue, and that he was a mighty civil gentleman. As soon as they returned home, the marriage was concluded. About a month afterward, Bluebeard told his wife that he was obliged to take a country journey for 6 weeks at least, about affairs of very great consequence, desiring her to divert herself, in his absence, to send for her friends and acquaintances, to carry them into the country if she pleased, and to make good cheer wherever she was. "Here," said he, "are the keys of the 2 great wardrobes, wherein I have my best furniture. These are of my silver and gold plate, which is not in everyday use. These open my strong boxes, which hold my money, both gold and silver. These my caskets of jewels, and this is the master key to all my apartments. But for this little one here, it is the key of the closet at the end of the great gallery on the ground floor. Open them all, go into all and every one of them, except that little closet, which I forbid you, and forbid it in such a manner that if you happen to open it, there's nothing but what you may expect from my just anger and resentment." She promised to observe very exactly whatever he had ordered, when he, after having embraced her, got into his coach and proceeded on his journey. Her neighbours and friends did not stay to be sent for by the new married lady, so great was their impatience to see all the rich furniture of her house, not daring to come while her husband was there, because of his blue beard, which frightened them. They ran through all the rooms, closets, and wardrobes, which were all so fine and rich that they seemed to surpass one another. After that they went up into the 2 great rooms, where was the best and richest furniture. They could not sufficiently admire the number and beauty of the tapestries, beds, couches, cabinets, stands, tables, and looking-glasses, in which you might see yourself from head to foot. Some of them were framed with glass, others with silver, plain and gilded, the finest and most magnificent ever were seen. They ceased not to extol and envy the happiness of their friend, who in the meantime in no way diverted herself in looking upon all these rich things, because of the impatience she had to go and open the closet on the ground floor. She was so much pressed by her curiosity, that without considering that it was very uncivil to leave her company, she went down a little back staircase, and with such excessive haste that she had twice or thrice like to have broken her neck. Coming to the closet door, she made a stop for some time, thinking upon her husband's orders, and considering what unhappiness might attend her if she was disobedient. But the temptation was so strong she could not overcome it. She then took the little key, and opened it, trembling, but could not at first see anything plainly, because the windows were shut. After some moments she began to perceive that the floor was all covered over with clotted blood, on which lay the bodies of several dead women, ranged against the walls. These were all the wives whom Bluebeard had married and murdered one after another. She thought she would have died for fear, and the key which she pulled out of the lock fell out of her hand. After having somewhat recovered her surprise, she took up the key, locked the door, and went upstairs into the chamber to recover herself. But she could not, she was so much frightened. Having observed that the key of the closet was stained with blood, she tried 2 or 3 times to wipe it off, but the blood would not come out. In vain did she wash it, and even rub it with soap and sand. The blood still remained, for the key was magical, and she could never make it quite clean. When the blood was gone off from one side, it came again on the other. Bluebeard returned from his journey the same evening, and said he had received letters upon the road informing him that the affair he went about was ended to his advantage. His wife did all she could to convince him that she was extremely glad of his speedy return. Next morning he asked her for the keys, which she gave him, but with such a trembling hand that he easily guessed what had happened. "What," said he, "is not the key of my closet among the rest?" "I must certainly have left it above upon the table," said she. "Fail not to bring it to me presently," said Bluebeard. After several goings backward and forward, she was forced to bring him the key. Bluebeard, having very attentively considered it, said to his wife, "How comes this blood upon the key?" "I do not know," cried the poor woman, paler than death. "You do not know," replied Bluebeard. "I very well know. You were resolved to go into the closet, were you not? Mighty well, madam, you shall go in, and take your place among the ladies you saw there." Upon this she threw herself at her husband's feet, and begged his pardon with all the signs of true repentance, vowing that she would never more be disobedient. She would have melted a rock, so beautiful and sorrowful was she, but Bluebeard had a heart harder than any rock. "You must die, madam," said he, "and that presently." "Since I must die," answered she, looking upon him with her eyes all bathed in tears, "give me some little time to say my prayers." "I give you," replied Bluebeard, "half a quarter of an hour, but not one moment more." When she was alone, she called out to her sister, and said to her, "Sister Anne," for that was her name, "go up, I beg you, upon the top of the tower, and look if my brothers are not coming over. They promised me that they would come today, and if you see them, give them a sign to make haste." Her sister Anne went to the top of the tower, and the poor afflicted wife cried out from time to time, "Anne, Sister Anne, do you see anyone coming?" And Sister Anne said, "I see nothing but the sun, which makes a dust, and the grass, which looks green." In the meanwhile, Bluebeard, holding a great sabre in his hand, cried out as loud as he could bawl to his wife, "Come down instantly, or I shall come up to you." "One moment longer, if you please," said his wife, and then she cried out very softly, "Anne, Sister Anne, dost thou see anybody coming?" And Sister Anne answered, "I see nothing but the sun, which makes a dust, and the grass, which is green." "Come down quickly," cried Bluebeard, "or I will come up to you." "I am coming," answered his wife, and then she cried, "Anne, Sister Anne, dost thou not see anyone coming?" "I see," replied Sister Anne, "a great dust, which comes on this side here." "Are they my brothers?" "Alas, no, my dear sister, I see a flock of sheep." "Will you not come down?" cried Bluebeard. "One moment longer," said his wife, and then she cried out, "Anne, Sister Anne, dost thou see anybody coming?" "I see," said she, "two horsemen, but they are yet a great way off." "God be praised," replied the poor wife joyfully. "They are my brothers. I will make them a sign, as well as I can, for them to make haste." Then Bluebeard bawled out so loud that he made the whole house tremble. The distressed wife came down and threw herself at his feet, all in tears, with her hair about her shoulders. "That signifies nothing," says Bluebeard. "You must die." Then, taking hold of her hair with one hand, and lifting up the sword with the other, he was going to take off her head. The poor lady, turning about to him and looking at him with dying eyes, desired him to afford her one little moment to recollect herself. "No, no," said he, "recommend thyself to God," and was just ready to strike. At this very instant there was such a loud knocking at the gate that Bluebeard made a sudden stop. The gate was opened, and presently entered two horsemen, who, drawing their swords, ran directly to Bluebeard. He knew them to be his wife's brothers, one a dragoon, the other a musketeer, so that he ran away immediately to save himself. But the two brothers pursued so close that they overtook him before he could get to the steps of the porch, when they ran their swords through his body and left him dead. The poor wife was almost as dead as her husband, and had not strength enough to rise and welcome her brothers. Bluebeard had no heirs, and so his wife became mistress of all his estate. She made use of one part of it to marry her sister Anne to a young gentleman who had loved her a long while, another part to buy captains' commissions for her brothers, and the rest to marry herself to a very worthy gentleman, who made her forget the ill time she had passed with Bluebeard. End of Bluebeard.
Trusty John, The Blue Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. The Blue Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. Chapter 30. Trusty John. Once upon a time there was an old king who was so ill that he thought to himself, "I am most likely on my deathbed." Then he said, "Send Trusty John to me." Now Trusty John was his favourite servant, and was so called because all his life he had served him so faithfully. When he approached the bed, the king spake to him, "Most trusty John, I feel my end is drawing near, and I could face it without a care were it not for my son. He is still too young to decide everything for himself, and unless you promise me to instruct him in all he should know, and to be to him as a father, I shall not close my eyes in peace." Then Trusty John answered, "I will never desert him, and will serve him faithfully, even though it should cost me my life." Then the old king said, "Now I die comforted and in peace." And then he went on, "After my death you must show him the whole castle, all the rooms and apartments and vaults, and all the treasures that lie in them. But you must not show him the last room in the long passage, where the picture of the Princess of the Golden Roof is hidden. When he beholds that picture he will fall violently in love with it, and go off into a dead faint, and for her sake he will encounter many dangers. You must guard him from this." And when Trusty John had again given the king his hand, upon it the old man became silent, laid his head on the pillow, and died. When the old king had been carried to his grave, Trusty John told the young king what he had promised his father on his deathbed, and added, "And I shall assuredly keep my word, and shall be faithful to you as I have been to him, even though it should cost me my life." Now when the time of mourning was over, Trusty John said to him, "It is time you should see your inheritance. I will show you your ancestral castle." So he took him over everything, and let him see all the riches and splendid apartments. Only the one room where the picture was he did not open, but the picture was placed so that if the door opened you gazed straight upon it, and it was so beautifully painted that you imagined it lived and moved, and that it was the most lovable and beautiful thing in the whole world. But the young king noticed that Trusty John always missed one door, and said, "Why do you never open this one for me?" "There is something inside that would appall you," he answered. But the king replied, "I have seen the whole castle, and shall find out what is in there." And with these words he approached the door, and wanted to force it open. But Trusty John held him back, and said, "I promised your father before his death that you shouldn't see what that room contains. It might bring both you and me to great grief." "Ah, no," answered the young king. "If I don't get in, it will be my certain destruction. I should have no peace night or day till I had seen what was in the room with my own eyes. Now I don't budge from the spot till you have opened the door." Then Trusty John saw there was no way out of it, so with a heavy heart and many sighs he took the key from the big bunch. When he had opened the door he stepped in first, and thought to cover the likeness so that the king might not perceive it. But it was hopeless. The king stood on tiptoe and looked over his shoulder, and when he saw the picture of the maid, so beautiful and glittering with gold and precious stones, he fell swooning to the ground. Trusty John lifted him up, carried him to bed, and thought sorrowfully, the curse has come upon us. Gracious heaven, what will be the end of it all?" Then he poured wine down his throat till he came to himself again. The first words he spoke were, "Oh, who is the original of the beautiful picture?" "She is the Princess of the Golden Roof," answered Trusty John. Then the King continued, "My love for her is so great that if all the leaves on the trees had tongues they could not express it. My very life depends on my winning her. You are my most trusty John. You must stand by me." The faithful servant pondered long how they were to set about the matter, for it was said to be difficult even to get into the presence of the Princess. At length he hit upon a plan, and spoke to the King. "All the things she has about her, tables, chairs, dishes, goblets, bowls, and all her household furniture are made of gold. You have in your treasure 5 tons of gold. Let the goldsmiths of your kingdom manufacture them into all manner of vases and vessels, into all sorts of birds and game and wonderful beasts. That will please her. We shall go to her with them and try our luck." The King summoned all his goldsmiths, and they had to work hard day and night, till at length the most magnificent things were completed. When a ship had been laden with them, the faithful John disguised himself as a merchant, and the King had to do the same, so that they should be quite unrecognizable. And so they crossed the seas, and journeyed till they reached the town where the Princess of the Golden Roof dwelt. Trusty John made the King remain behind on the ship and await his return. "Perhaps," he said, "I may bring the Princess back with me. So see that everything is in order. Let the gold ornaments be arranged, and the whole ship decorated." Then he took a few of the gold things in his apron, went ashore, and proceeded straight to the palace. When he came to the courtyard he found a beautiful maiden standing at the well, drawing water with 2 golden pails. And as she was about to carry away the glittering water, she turned round and saw the stranger, and asked him who he was. Then he replied, "I am a merchant," and opening his apron, he let her peep in. "Oh, my!" she cried, "what beautiful gold wares!" She set down her pails, and examined one thing after the other. Then she said, "The Princess must see this. She has such a fancy for gold things that she will buy up all you have." She took him by the hand and led him into the palace, for she was the lady's maid. When the Princess had seen the wares, she was quite enchanted, and said, "They are all so beautifully made that I shall buy everything you have." But Trusty John said, "I am only the servant of a rich merchant. What I have here is nothing compared to what my master has on his ship. His merchandise is more artistic and costly than anything that has ever been made in gold before." She desired to have everything brought up to her, but he said, "There is such a quantity of things that it would take many days to bring them up, and they would take up so many rooms that you would have no space for them in your house." Thus her desire and curiosity were excited to such an extent that at last she said, "Take me to your ship. I shall go there myself and view your master's treasures." Then Trusty John was quite delighted, and brought her to the ship, and the King, when he beheld her, saw that she was even more beautiful than her picture, and thought every moment that his heart would burst. She stepped on to the ship, and the King led her inside, but Trusty John remained behind with the steersman, and ordered the ship to push off. Spread all sail, that we may fly on the ocean like a bird in the air." Meanwhile the king showed the princess inside all his gold wares, every single bit of it, dishes, goblets, bowls, the birds and game, and all the wonderful beasts. Many hours passed thus, and she was so happy that she did not notice that the ship was sailing away. After she had seen the last thing, she thanked the merchant and prepared to go home. But when she came to the ship's side, she saw that they were on the high seas, far from land, and that the ship was speeding on its way under full canvas. "Oh!" she cried in terror, "I am deceived, carried away and betrayed into the power of a merchant. I would rather have died." But the king seized her hand and spake. "I am no merchant, but a king of as high birth as yourself, and it was my great love for you that made me carry you off by a stratagem. The first time I saw your likeness, I fell to the ground in a swoon." When the princess of the golden roof heard this, she was comforted, and her heart went out to him, so that she willingly consented to become his wife. Now it happened one day, while they were sailing on the high seas, that Trusty John, sitting on the forepart of the ship, fiddling away to himself, observed 3 ravens in the air flying toward him. He ceased playing, and listened to what they were saying, for he understood their language. The one croaked, "Ha ha! So he's bringing the princess of the golden roof home." "Yes," answered the second, "but he's not got her yet." "Yes, he has," spake the third, "for she's sitting beside him on the ship." Then number 1 began again and cried, "That'll not help him. When they reach the land a chestnut horse will dash forward to greet them. The king will wish to mount it, and if he does it will gallop away with him, and disappear into the air, and he will never see his bride again." "Is there no escape for him?" asked number 2. "Oh, yes. If someone else mounts quickly and shoots the horse dead with the pistol that is sticking in the holster, then the young king is saved." "But who's to do that?" "And anyone who knows it and tells him will be turned into stone from his feet to his knees." Then spake number 2, "I know more than that. Even if the horse is slain, the young king will still not keep his bride. When they enter the palace together, they will find a ready-made wedding shirt in a cupboard, which looks as though it were woven of gold and silver, but is really made of nothing but sulphur and tar. When the king puts it on, it will burn him to his marrow and bones." Number 3 asked, "Is there no way of escape, then?" "Oh, yes," answered number 2. "If someone seizes the shirt with gloved hands and throws it into the fire, and lets it burn, then the young king is saved." "But what's the good? Anyone knowing this and telling it will have half his body turned into stone, from his knees to his heart." Then number 3 spake, "I know yet more. Though the bridal shirt to be burnt, the king hasn't even then secured his bride. When the dance is held after the wedding, and the young queen is dancing, she will suddenly grow deadly white, and drop down like one dead, and unless someone lifts her up and draws 3 drops of blood from her right side, and spits them out again, she will die. But if anyone who knows this betrays it, he will be turned into stone from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet." When the ravens had thus conversed, they fled onward, but Trusty John had taken it all in, and was sad and depressed from that time forward. For if he were silent to his master concerning what he had heard, he would involve him in misfortune. But if he took him into his confidence, then he himself would forfeit his life. At last he said, "I will stand by my master, though it should be my ruin." Now when they drew near the land, it came to pass, just as the ravens had predicted, and a splendid chestnut horse bounded forward. "Capital," said the king, "this animal shall carry me to my palace," and was about to mount, but Trusty John was too sharp for him, and springing up quickly, seized the pistol out of the holster and shot the horse dead. Then the other servants of the king, who had no time looked favourably on Trusty John, cried out, "What a sin to kill the beautiful beast that was to bear the king to his palace!" But the king spake, "Silence! Let him alone. He is ever my Trusty John. Who knows for what good end he may have done this thing?" So they went on their way and entered the palace, and there in the hall stood a cupboard, in which lay the ready-made bridal shirt, looking for all the world as though it were made of gold and silver. The young king went toward it, and was about to take hold of it, but Trusty John, pushing him aside, seized it with his gloved hands, threw it hastily into the fire, and let it burn. The other servants commenced grumbling again, and said, "See, he's actually burning the king's bridal shirt." But the young king spoke, "Who knows for what good purpose he does it? Let him alone. He is my most trusty John." Then the wedding was celebrated, the dance began, and the bride joined in, but Trusty John watched her countenance carefully. Of a sudden she grew deadly white, and fell to the ground as if she were dead. He at once sprang hastily toward her, lifted her up, and bore her to a room, where he laid her down, and kneeling beside her, he drew 3 drops of blood from her right side, and spat them out. She soon breathed again and came to herself, but the young king had watched the proceeding, and not knowing why Trusty John had acted as he did, he flew into a passion, and cried, "Throw him into prison." On the following morning sentence was passed on Trusty John, and he was condemned to be hanged. As he stood on the gallows he said, "Everyone doomed to death has the right to speak once before he dies, and I too have that privilege." "Yes," said the king, "it shall be granted to you." So Trusty John spoke, "I am unjustly condemned, for I have always been faithful to you." And he proceeded to relate how he had heard the ravens' conversation on the sea, and how he had to do all he did in order to save his master. Then the king cried, "Oh, my most trusty John, pardon, pardon, take him down." But as he uttered the last word, Trusty John had fallen lifeless to the ground, and was as stone. The king and the queen were in despair, and the king spake, "Ah, how ill have I rewarded such great fidelity!" and made them lift up the stone image and place it in his bedroom near his bed. As often as he looked at it, he wept and said, "Oh, if I could only restore you to life, my most trusty John." After a time the queen gave birth to twins, 2 small sons, who throve and grew, and were a constant joy to her. One day, when the queen was at church, and the 2 children sat and played with their father, he gazed again full of grief on the stone statue, and sighing, wailed, "Oh, if I could only restore you to life, my most trusty John." Suddenly the stone began to speak, and said, "Yes, You can restore me to life again, if you are prepared to sacrifice what you hold most dear." And the king cried out, "All I have in the world will I give up for your sake." The stone continued, "If you cut off with your own hand the heads of your 2 children, and smear me with their blood, I shall come back to life." The king was aghast when he heard that he had himself to put his children to death, but when he thought of Trusty John's fidelity, and how he had even died for him, he drew his sword, and with his own hand cut the heads off his children. And when he had smeared the stone with their blood, life came back, and Trusty John stood once more safe and sound before him. He spake to the king, "Your loyalty shall be rewarded." And taking up the heads of the children, he placed them on their bodies, smeared the wounds with their blood, and in a minute they were all right again and jumping about as if nothing had happened. Then the king was full of joy, and when he saw the queen coming, he hid Trusty John and the 2 children in a big cupboard. As she entered, he said to her, "Did you pray in church?" "Yes," she answered, "but my thoughts dwelt constantly on Trusty John, and of what he has suffered for us." Then he spake, "Dear wife, we can restore him to life, but the price asked is our 2 little sons. We must sacrifice them." The queen grew white and her heart sank, but she replied, "We owe it to him on account of his great fidelity." Then he rejoiced that she was of the same mind as he had been, and going forward he opened the cupboard, and fetched the 2 children and Trusty John out, saying, "God be praised, Trusty John is free once more, and we have our 2 small sons again." Then he related to her all that had passed, and they lived together happily ever afterward. Footnote: Grimm. End of footnote. End of story.